Breaking news flashed across the huge screens. The head of NASA had called a conference because of the critical situation. Everyone was glued to the displays. A grown man with a serious look was broadcasting something, and it was as if he was looking through the TV with his green eyes straight into my soul. He addressed absolutely everyone on our planet and put it on the record that their organization was opening a new chapter in space exploration. Up there high, in the space that is home to the stars, their device had already been launched and its camera lens was already capturing what was in front of it. A probe flying close to Mars was able to capture something strange. The photo was shown on a screen and explained what the image demonstrates. A huge man-made structure has been found orbiting the planet. It's believed to be the likeness of a spaceship from another solar system, but there was something else interesting. This giant artifact sends distress signals in the form of radio signal waves, but it has been confirmed that there has been no response. Someone watched it with a piece of meat on a fork like it was some kind of entertainment video. As it turned out, this video was saved 1 year ago and no breaking news, and remembered those naive hopes of people who knew nothing back then. The man reminisced about the old days and commented that this video was better for watching while eating. You could tell from the interior that it was the distant future and the world had taken broad steps forward. The guy, still unfamiliar to us, turned to the robot beside him, asking if it agreed with the creature, which was inanimate but seemed more alive and sentient than other humans. In that video, the man assured that NASA had decided to immediately send a manned expedition to the site, mobilizing all available resources and technology. The screen showed a rough outline of what was happening and indicated that additional research would continue on Earth until the probes entered orbit around the planet. Finally, the lunch in my plate had worn itself out. With only the remains of the sauce left, my fork slid down and my stomach rumbled in appreciation. The voice of the man on the screen, who was addressing the citizens and talking about how going to Mars was a difficult and dangerous journey, grew quieter. Recalling the press headlines and pictures of a manned expedition to an extraterrestrial artifact shortly after arriving in orbit of the NA. And then there was panic over a suspected invasion. Bodies began to walk on their own. Preparations for an epidemic. Mobilization began. The number of infected grew larger and larger. The collapse of the military command system. Cadets were drafted for military service. They were abandoned on a camp. Though initially told to remain calm, about soon the president approved the unrestricted use of combat power, and all survivors were instructed to evacuate from underground facilities and air defenses. The man on the TV warned citizens that humanity is no longer alone, so it's worth supporting each other. The boat picked at his mouth with a toothpick, chuckling at such words. He now knew what would happen a little later. The manager of the asylum system, survivor Seo Jinsu, assured me that he was not alone at all and took great pride in that fact. The guy looked up and thanked someone, as usual, for the delicious food. Above him was a flying drone-like device, his assistant, Artemis, but there was no response. Only the lens was pointed at Seo Jinsu and watched him intently. That's when the guy pointed his toothpick at the drone and said irritably that he knew the girl was listening to him anyway and let him not pretend. And that a hologram started to appear right from this machine. A delicate pale female face showed. The persona finally began to suppress the signs. Artemis was the artificial intelligence of the asylum's control center. A beautiful girl in a tight blouse with an overworldly look and tone replied that of course Jinsu would be grateful, except that she'd picked up on the fact that the guy had gotten his aim wrong. He seemed like he should have said that to the chef, the same chef who was standing there with a baffled expression on the screen, because he was trying really hard. And the manager of the asylum system agreed that he was supposed to do just that. However, to those who have perfectly calculated and controlled everything from the marbled meats he prefers to the recipe that takes into account his tastes and serving time. And so Jinsu reminded that it was all thanks to Artemis. The latter stood with a serious look at first, and then with a cute smile. She reiterated again what the guy had just said, and of course she liked it. And then she started twirling a strand of hair on her finger, saying that yes, it wouldn't even take a picosecond to determine what portion so Jinsu needed. For her, there was only one step between an experimental cancer cell culture and a human being. The guy concluded that this, then so and so should be ashamed of it, to which the girl replied that the guy had finally lost his mind, and urgently sent him to the infirmary. After he sleeps a little on the operating table, his mind will be renewed. She decided to make a huge indulgence, and will be so kind and fix the primitive brain with stupid thoughts for free. Seo Jinsu got angry and said he didn't need it. He said the girl couldn't imagine what kind of chobit she'd get, and then got up and said it was time for them to go check out the cultural facilities. The girl coughed softly, embarrassed, now. And then Artemis asked what about the anal suture surgery. She thought it would be much better. And the guy turned to yelling and started saying that he had already mentioned and that he would never do such a thing. The refuge system manager was looking at his tablet reading information about the universal tank. The efficiency was 68%, and the notes added that a total of 31 parts needed to be replaced. Judging from this information, the guy concluded that things were a bit dangerous. Artemis was flying nearby and was also watching everything, observing. Drone said that such a comment perfectly summarized the whole situation, and the guy asked what was wrong again, since the girl's voice had become so over the top again. The guy tried to walk down the hallway to keep his distance with the artificial intelligence, and the one, as if they were a married couple, reminded him of all the things it does for Seo Jinsu, that it grows ingredients, cooks food, and purifies water for him. It also cleans the dirty carbon dioxide he exhales in addition, and the interlocutor, who was now being pestered with these reproaches, sighing heavily, realized that it was starting again, that he could not help but recognize that this was the truth. He was indeed being cared for very carefully. The ball had sagged from the forceful impact on the bat and was ready to fly off with tremendous recoil. Brunette did a good job of fouling off pitches while playing baseball on a huge field. And Artemis was reminded of that, namely how she, when Seo Jinsu got bored, ran a pitching simulator for him, a favorite of his, and organized holographic support from the stands. And as a bonus, she adjusted his pitches so that even his worst swing turned out to be a home run. And that, too, was a truth the lad understood and accepted. Every time the brunette's body is covered in goose flesh, the girl immediately turns on the heating, and when he goes to the bathroom, adjusts the water to her favorite 34 degrees. And the fact that Seo Jinsu had never once gotten significantly sick after moving here, all thanks to the fact that the artificial intelligence kept his immune system in perfect condition, and all just because of her. Diving lower and lower under the water, as if trying to hide from the whole world, the guy thought about the fact that this was also the right information and wording. This all reminded the guy, while he was fixing the robots they need for their work and leaving it idle, is totally unacceptable. Seo Jinsu pretended that he thought nothing of the matter and simply asked for a 12mm hex wrench to be handed to him. Artemis obediently gave the tool, but not in her hand, but propped it on the guy's cheek, but asked her interlocutor to think about whether there was anyone in his life who would give him as much attention and care as she did. And even here, the girl cornered Seo Jinsu by saying that other people would probably reply that they were parents, but unfortunately he didn't have any. The brunette remembered what had happened this year. He was angry at the mention of it all. He had been hurt, but it was the truth and he couldn't just deny it. Artemis kept chiseling the brain of the manager of the shelter system, saying that she was putting herself out there to grow everything. All the while the guy was doing other things as well. And Jinsu-sen doesn't appreciate it all. He hasn't even said thank you once. And when the opportunity to improve their flawed relationship comes up, she asked about whether it's right that he can't do her a small favor. I tried to press pity, saying that the brunette has no conscience at all. And Seo Jinsu replied that trying to change his mind is useless. He doesn't mean no, because if you sew someone's ass up, it will kill them. And anyway, it was a completely inappropriate time. He was just sitting on the toilet, so he recommended that Artemis at least have some respect for other people's personal space. But even here artificial intelligence found a way to get to the bottom of it and start a new scandal. She turned the hands of the clock back to the guy, asking him if he cared about the personal space of the ants that crawled in the acrylic formicarium. Jinsu washing his hands and marveling at how sensitive the girl was to cleanliness. More precisely, she does not tolerate the products of living beings, especially humans, which of course did not like the guy himself, because it is a natural process. So every chance she gets, she suggests weird things like sewing up her anus, which is just silly. Artemis reminded her that there was no place in the shelter protected from her eyes and ears, so there was no place to take cover, which made sense, otherwise it would just be a toe. The girl snapped her fingers and pointed her index finger directly at the speakers, saying that her will pierce the world like lightning, and her power was everywhere, from giant cars to tiny lights. Loud sounds immediately started pouring from the stereos. Jinsu was startled by it. The sound was too loud and unexpected. and the artificial intelligence kept talking about her eyes piercing the darkness and her ears picking up every sound. She reminded the brunette of the saying people say out of habit, and the guy couldn't stand everything going on around him anymore. So he decided it would be easier to just agree with her before his eardrums burst. The manager of the asylum fell to his knees and began to pray and bow and called the holographic lady before him the will of heaven, the eyes of heaven, the anger of heaven, and Artemis liked it immensely. She touched her hand to herself and began to say that this saying was perfect for her, and now it was good that her interlocutor understood it too. Immediately she vanished into thin air, scattering into small pixels. Her sentence was interrupted. She clearly hadn't just disappeared and said everything she had intended to say. Seo Jinsu looked at the drone in an attempt to figure out what was even going on and where Artemis had gone. Bits of her image still flickering in the air. And then the state of the device switched to using an emergency power source. The power supply should eventually be restored. Naturally, Jins didn't like this turn of events. He didn't understand what was going on, and it took some time to realize what was going on. The guy saw no logical explanation for what had just happened. He clenched his teeth, the most unrealistic reasons popping into his head. Looking around, he was already beginning to suspect that the heavens were indeed angry, and the program window kept repeating that power was being restored. The program began to support the voice of Artemis. Seo Jinsu felt that somehow the power failures had begun to occur too often lately. And then the girl reappeared in all her glory and explained that the problem was not that serious and it was only a temporary inconvenience. Besides, everything here was under her control. The guy breathed a sigh of relief. It was good that everything was solved that way. He believed every word she said, understanding that she was the one in charge. And Artemis replied that even so, it was impossible to know exactly how long this place would last. Artificial intelligence has started to talk about being able to easily solve software problems, but not everything in the world. For example, equipment problems are difficult for her, or rather even unrealistic. She set her hand aside and tried to create a nut. Of course, it didn't work out. A hologram won't become reality no matter how you spin it, and parts can't be created out of thin air. And then the guy turned his back to her and began to speak loudly and defiantly, as if addressing the heavens, asking the self-proclaimed goddess to perform a miracle. Artemis looked at it all with a suspicious look, furrowing her eyebrows, and then expressed her doubt that there are gods who grant miracles without sacrifice. Ever since she woke up, she had been taking care of Seo Jinsu, but she didn't remember getting anything in return. The guy didn't like the way they were talking to him now. He concluded that his joke was simply not understood. So he hurriedly apologized for making fun of the girl. He started to walk away, saying that anyway, always saying that for the sake of maintenance parts, they needed to get out of here, his body moving further down the hallway. Then he turned and replied that it was a problem for later and the answer this time would be the same. So for now, we should wait. And Artemis was in agreement with that opinion, or just accepted it simply because she had heard it so many times before. She still has no control over the outside world. To be more precise, there's a heightened risk factor in that place. It was her way of trying to show her concern. But Seo Jinsu didn't seem to understand this. He asked the artificial intelligence itself to think about the fact that equipment problems should be solved at the first sign of not going away. A kind of irritability appeared on his face. And with power problems becoming more and more frequent every day, and some robots are left to repair and just standing dead weight. If a brunette feels a stench in the air, the filters in the fan need to be changed immediately. And besides, these aren't their only problems. The guy summarized that if they kept putting things off, one day everything would break all at once, and simply waiting would not reduce such risk factors, only do the opposite. But Artemis asked for a little more patience. She turned around and gave her usual stern look, saying that everything had its time, and it was up to her to decide when it would come. The guy looked at her with incomprehension as to what that meant, why he wasn't listening or trying to understand. She reminded her that the duty of a refuge system manager is to keep her body in shape, and Artemis immediately disappeared from view, vanishing into thin air. Feet in athletic sneakers braked across the floor as if fire was about to erupt from beneath them. Seo Jinsu was practicing, this time with tennis. Right now he was hitting the ball with a racket. The game was intense and very active. The guy was trying to focus on his movements, perfecting each stroke. The opponent could not repel such a serve, so the ball passed, bouncing off the floor. Now Seo Jinsu had a new record and the artificial intelligence had lost dryly. The brunette wiped the sweat from his face, thinking it was time for a change of venue. The non-real audience, just a hologram, was thrilled. They applauded, screamed, cheered for the real person. On site selection, the number 1 popped up. Its detail is small sight. And then the guy's eyes slid a little to the side, and he saw a picture that would make anyone happy, but not with the realization that you're playing with fake people. There was a plaque with the top players, and all the spots had Seo Jinsu's name on them, not a single line without letters denoting his name. But, as it turned out, on the huge screen there were results not only for one game. There was everything your soul desires: baseball, volleyball, tennis, badminton, ping pong, and everywhere there was only one common detail. It was the name of the manager of the asylum system. The guy did not want to continue training, decided that for today is enough. He headed down the hallway, thinking about the place where he was now imprisoned, by his own free will, and where he must live the rest of his life. He was going down the stairs and the training room of the shelter he was in, the so-called number 1 Aegis Civil Disaster Prevention urban type system, and it was divided into 3 large zones, 3 large floors, top, center and bottom, and on the last was the civilian living area. But unfortunately, this sector was locked down. The number that indicated the current number of residents was shot down, in error, simply because they weren't here. Moreover, of all the 3 areas, this one is the largest, huge houses that aspire upwards, neat paths flanked by green trees. It has a huge growing and hydroponics facility that can supply a variety of fruits and vegetables. And it also had the provision of a semi-permanent automatic thermonuclear generator on it. Besides, a city-sized housing complex capable of accommodating tens of thousands of people is best suited to the name of a shelter that is designed to expand as needed. But what's the point when all the sectors are blocked off and no one but Seo Jinsu himself is here? As a kind of small industrial complex, equipped with resources to equipment to maintain and repair the entire shelter. This is practically a one-stop factory. A bunch of products are made there, a bunch of colorful packages everywhere. It seemed like the gluttons wanted to visit this particular factory. After all, it can produce absolutely everything from alcohol and snacks to multifunctional robots. But the only problem was that access was now denied, a consequence of the blockade order. Both areas are quarantined for some circumstances, which was just hard to look at without thinking about how to remedy the situation. Always indulging his whims, Artemis never gave him access to these areas under any circumstances. So unfortunately, the only place Seo Jinsu can get to is the VIP area on the top floor. It's a huge building, with super high walls, with seating and activities dotted all around. Except it just looks awfully lonely when you're the only one here. Everything for not to be bored and have fun, not to think about problems, karaoke and, of course, billiards. A large water park and spa with massage. There is absolutely everything that the human soul desires during a vacation. The upper floor, with all its amusements, which are clearly more than necessary, is rather a resort for a select few and their entourage. The current number of residents is now 1 and it was Seo Jinsu. The guy arrived at this VIP floor and walked down the stairs to the bottom. Just after construction was completed, in an undetermined time frame the blockade began. And Jinsu, who was checking the control system at the time, was the only occupant. He didn't know what to do. He was thinking of exercising or relaxing at the spa. And then there was a very loud sound that startled the guy a lot. Suddenly the lights went out, and now it was just a horrible combo as my ears were filled with a very loud sound. Just deafening. And my eyes went blind. He was completely alone, in total darkness, and now it was a real horror story. He froze, waiting to see what would happen next. This time was different from previous outages. Red lights came on around the perimeter and it was all very much like an earthquake. And wondering how to behave in such a situation. The system status, unto emergency power supply. Only a voice could be heard now. The notes of Artemis' voice came from the screen. She was addressing Jins, but something was wrong with her. The guy listened intently to what the girl would say, and she ordered him to head to the control room. And when she added that it had to be done immediately, Jinsu tensed up a lot, meaning something very serious had happened. In just a couple seconds he was already standing in the upper area, the central control tower. Artemis worriedly explained the fact that they had a problem that needed to be solved urgently. Just recently sensors detected a large explosion in the lower sector. The location was power plant facilities, a fusion reactor. Fortunately, The power generation apparatus appears stable for now, but because the reactor's self-maintenance system is using an impressive amount of energy to fight the fire, the blackout had occurred throughout the entire shelter. And now the brunette realized what had caused everything around him to shake so much and the power to go out. And he now wondered about the possibility of repeated incidents. Artemis replied that there was not enough information to draw conclusions, but there were specific signs of anomaly and highlighted diagrams and pictures for clarity on the screen. An unknown atmospheric component is spreading across the lower sector power plant area. Then she demonstrated the readings before the explosion and after, where there was a huge difference between the two numbers. The guy asked if the girl meant that this substance was the cause of the explosion, but she said that at the moment she could not see any other explanation based on logic. The concentration value dropped after the explosion, but is now going up again. And also the velocity and area of spread are increasing faster than before. And then Artemis emphasized that if they let this stuff continue to spread like this, there would be a massive explosion that would cause irreparable damage to the fusion reactor. The brunette was now very determined. He asked how much time they had left before the explosion and tapped his hand on the table. Artemis appeared behind him and Seo Jinsu turned to face her, waiting for that very important answer. And the girl started saying that by the simulation's calculations, they had very little time, literally less than 2 days. Only 42 hours left and now Jinsu was just out. This is a shock. He expected at least a week to solve the problem, but not the same limitation. The refuge system manager asked if anything could be done from here, but received an answer that denied that possibility. The girl explained that the lower sector didn't even have any cameras to monitor the area, let alone any kind of control, which was why it was urgent to summon Seo Jinsu. Currently, Artemis' area of control is limited to the upper sector, with the middle and lower region completely isolated from communication. The girl looked at her manicure, showing a complete lack of concern for the situation, saying that the reason was quite simple. The VIP visitors couldn't even get in, and during their sudden deaths, it wasn't possible to get those areas under proper control. At the very least, given the upper-level powers they have now, Jinsu stood at the control panel and thought about what he could do. And it is with him as the maintenance administrator of the system that the odds are pretty good. Cracking access to the hardware one by one over the next few days, rummaging through wires and piles of machinery. Something, yes, will work out. As a result, they will be able to overcome all the difficult problems and transfer the data to Artemis. The guy was just about to experience the new not-so-simple toy in his hands. It was something akin to a hologram gun. And with this device, Jinsu was supposed to make it easy on himself. Artemis warned that it's not that simple, it's incomparable in evolution, so advised not to play with the weapon in question, but what the light touches, even without direct contact, and the artificial intelligence will be able to program or send commands. From operating electronic doors and remotely controlling cars, to taking control of NAL supercomputers. And Seo Jinsu said that this is just a great device. After all, it is a remote hacking device. Roughly speaking, the interviewee replied that he can call it whatever he wants. Just let him be more careful and operate it with caution. It was still just a prototype, and range of effectiveness of 50 centimeters, to a powerful waves that could easily damage cameras and various sensors, and to such an extent that they could cause significant damage to a person's body. And now Jinsu stopped playing with such a dangerous weapon, and froze. He got cranky, whining that it was worth talking about this kind of thing right away. It's such basic safety stuff. And Artemis replied in her defense that she didn't expect the guy to start putting a laser to his hands for no particular reason. While Jinsu shook his hand to cool it down a bit, the hologram said the intelligence level was like a bug flying straight into the light of a lamp. After playfully adding that maybe she should start calling the guy Bug in honor of such a thing, a faint smile played at the corners of her lips. The guy stuck out his tongue and, with a look of displeasure after a brief pause of silence, apologized and put forward a request that his interlocutor keep this in mind for the future. Anyways, Seo Jinsu once again queried about what he should do if the guy parked correctly. Then take this thing and go down there. Artemis replied that that was the correct statement and began to create the new schema in her hands. The shelter system manager's mission was that, using the device, he could relay it to the two control rooms in the middle and lower sectors, and was showing the schematic on a holographic map. Afterward, her slender and graceful fingers snapped, preparing another spectacular display. The wall began to shine through, or rather the pixels on it began to show a completely different picture. It was the plan that would allow the girl to take control of this entire asylum. Jinsu looked at everything going on around him and tried to take in every detail. And then the artificial intelligence began to resent the expression on the brunette's face, which said that it didn't really want to do it right now. It was completely incomprehensible to Artemis why was causing this particular reaction, when the guy always complained when she asked for a bit of a wait before starting anything. She was tousling a strand of hair and explaining that she lived in a different time than people, and suddenly a thought came into her head that makes you think about yourself for a long time, namely, that the girl would be interested to know how painful this eternal waiting time would be for her. She lowered her eyes somehow sadly, beautiful, with long lashes, but not real, and added that her ward would never even know it, for her kingdom, which, according to the ideas and hopes of its future inhabitants, was supposed to be completely perfect, failed to live up to those expectations. After losing control of it, destruction and all sorts of filth, the living dead, and just plain creepy visuals settled in. They were rabid and threw themselves at anything that moved, trying to devour it, sometimes even fighting their own kind. 1 nanosecond. It was, time in general, divided down to the picosecond. The monsters took over the homeworld. Artemis looked up at the roofs of the buildings from a bird's eye view and held her palm to the glass as if trying to touch everything that was there. Behind the glass, she was sad about the pain she was experiencing that was impossible to get used to. It was eerily scary. Jinsu looked at her and couldn't figure out how to react to such words. A very tense moment. But Artemis interrupted the silence by promising that such an experience would not happen again. She was sure of it, and asked the brunette to be her messenger and open a new path for her. The girl needed it for such a thing, for her voice to be heard around the world, a measure of necessity. Jinsu became serious and pondered about what to do now, and there was no point in refusing. It also depended on the fact that there was no special choice. The first place to start is this small shelter, though the small shelter only seemed small. The brunette stood in the locker room by the lockers, busily packing for his expedition. The lad put on his armor, thinking about how this assignment would go, and whether he would be able to do the duty he must do. Behind his back he hid the axe in a position where he could use it with ease, though he hoped that wasn't what he would need. He took the huge cannon in his hands, looked at it carefully, as if he was quite used to having such a heavy thing in his hands by now. With a sudden movement of his hand, he reloaded his weapon to double-check either himself or his weapon. Aimed, trying to inspect absolutely everything must be perfect and work out in the end to his favor, of course. He evaluated the weapon given to him and called it very not bad, although he realized that it was something with something. Artemis was flying behind and watching the whole picture. She couldn't help but remind them that it was all thanks to her and her tending to the armory, asking for praise. And then I decided to add that I didn't expect Jinsu to smuggle in contraband from Korea too, but the guy justified it by saying that it was nothing, because he only smuggled in a little bit. The brunette boasted that he even had carbon fiber mesh grenades with good cutting power, and the girl was surprised, because this way it turns out that no grip devices are needed either. And the guy added that this detail is very well covered, and that's why this masterpiece is banned from sale. He put ammo in the magazine, and reasoned that if he could watch all the vantage points, there was one more thing to think about. Jinsu inserted the magazine into the rifle, slamming it loudly and determined to take action. The guy continued his thought that it wouldn't hurt at all to be prepared for the worst-case scenario, except that his tone of voice didn't sound like he was talking about some kind of entertainment. Artemis didn't quite know what her subordinate was talking about, so she decided she needed to help and add motivation. The brunette reached for the mask on the table and placed it over his face, all preparation almost over. The girl explained that when they take over the shelter, they will start researching infection mechanisms in order to eliminate all these horrible infections, and the shelter manager was glad to hear such information. And then the artificial intelligence added the fact that those pollutants that the guy was producing might be unpleasant, but that could be endured. But what those creatures were spreading was just disgusting, because she wasn't a primitive creature like Jinsu who was releasing dirt, which was all. Artemis was worried about the safety of the guy. That's why she asked if he needed a combat stabilizer, and the fighter refused such an offer, relying on the fact that he wasn't a child, therefore he wouldn't need such a thing. Jinsu headed forward, hiding his weapon behind his back. He stood up firmly and refused to even ask questions about the plan of action because he had already thought out the route and clearly knows what to do. The girl sarcastically commented that the manager was in charge of the system here. Then Seo Jinsu asked Artemis about her role, and she was so reproachful to him. The latter only looked at him in response and said that she was the owner. The door opened and a bright light blinded the guy standing in front of them. Now the fighter is ready to begin his mission and deal with the evil that has engulfed all around the path and will have to be splattered with the blood of monsters. The outside world looked very eerie. There was nothing left, no light, just dust, debris and gloom, the remains of some structures. Artemis nearby was lighting the way, and Seo Jinsu was in a nasty shock at what had fallen into his eye. He saw the scratches on the walls, and all the horrible chaos that was going on around him. The corpse's arm, which was hanging from the wall, all turned out to be much worse than the guy had imagined while standing on top of it. There were handprints all around, except that they were bloody, which was frightening, and goosebumps went down my body. The guy moved forward, and the drone behind him followed quietly, illuminating the road with a cold light. Despite the mask on his face, which was supposed to help with foreign odors, the notes of blood still made their way to his nostrils. As it turned out, it was Artemis who had simply forgotten to block the mask from infiltrating odor particles from the outside environment, and had only now offered to enable the feature, and Seo Jinsu had refused such help. All because all the senses need to be on alert and you need to be more attentive. Ahead slowly walked a monster that growled very loudly and looked for its way. No one would dare approach it, much less contact and anger it. His face was very ugly. Bulging eyes, a torn mouth and a bunch of crooked teeth. These guys were very visible on screen, but in person they are even uglier. Artemis wanted to update the workaround already. After all, you have to avoid fights as much as possible, but the manager refused to do that either. That horrible creature was just about to go berserk, and Seo Jinsu was determined to make a real breakthrough by lunging at the monster with his axe. He was incredibly confident that he could handle it. After all, there was only one mutant anyway. You can't just pass up an opportunity to gain experience like this. And just when the guy was almost at his target, the monster turned to face him, hearing stomping behind him. But the freak didn't expect to see him being rushed at such speed, and only had time to be surprised by making the slightest sound, a growl. He sliced the monster in half with his blade, as Seo blood rushing from within, the axe handling the bones, the muscles so easily. Now Seo Jinsu has lived up to his expectations. In terms of vulnerability, mutants aren't that much different from humans. Artemis, however, corrected her partner, saying that if anyone were to be sawed in half, there would be instant death, despite any origin of the creature, which prevented the brunette from enjoying his joke. And then the manager decided to ask about whether she thought the day was going to even, especially with that axe, but he better not think so, because from around the corner the next opponent was already waiting for them. And Artemis was the first to manage to see the monster, which was already too fast, and now the robot was trying to warn the brunette of the danger. Seo Jinsu barely had time to turn around to at least defend himself in such a tense moment when the enemy was already roaring in anticipation to tear into his victim. Still, the brunette managed to grab tighter and clasp his hands, just in time to fight back. And he didn't miss, he hit right in the head. The axe entered it even too easily. And it was all thanks to the enormous strength in the hands of the guy who had been practicing all this time, without tiring his hands. But Seo Jinsu didn't try to stop, and with the same strong hands, he advanced the blade straight into the depths of the skull. Except he wasn't the only one who was strong enough. His opponent immediately fought back, knocking the brunette to the floor and was already lunging at him with a counterattack. Seo Jinsu struggled to get up, his body trembling to the slightest centimeter, and the artificial intelligence was still supporting the guy in the same way, telling him to get up as quickly as possible and pull himself together. Growls and shouts spread around. The drone warned that only 3 objects had been detected now, well, at least so far. The horrible, simply disgusting mutants noticed their would-be assassin come to his senses and headed in his direction, only to get ahead of him in the attack. But the heroes did not try to give any fight back. At the moment their main goal was to survive, so hurried to escape as quickly as possible. But the monsters could also run fast. Now they would not abandon their target, so set about speeding after their prey. Before my eyes, a warning appeared in my glasses that there were obstacles ahead. The robot didn't understand where they were hiding, that they all came out at once, and then she reproached the guy for the fact that she had suggested him to find a way around from the beginning. And Seo Jinsu asked in a situation like this, if Artemis couldn't help or advise something, then let him keep quiet. Suddenly he saw that there was a corpse lying in front of him. Nothing surprising in this kind of environment, but still unexpected. The brunette was getting closer and closer to the body and asked about whether the infected could die a natural death, and the girl replied that they had no choice. It was the only way out. The bow was jumping over the body and Artemis minded once again to pass very carefully, but they couldn't see the face of the mutant who was just waiting to be approached. Immediately he stood up and swung his arm to hit right at the hero who had just interrupted all such creatures. Seo Jinsu was shocked that this monster was able to pretend to be dead, and the robot asked to remain calm, for he was not injured. While the infectious one without normal limbs was trying to crawl up to the guy was running and would have liked to follow the new route further, no stopping, just running, so could be thrown off his tail. Artemis updated the route line. They were advancing on sector number 2. It was already marked on the pocket personal computer, still at least 412 meters, to the mid-sector control room. The brunette was silent. He was already very tired, so he turned to his companion. Seo Jinsu hid behind a wall and tried to catch his breath. He said that despite all his experience on the battlefield, it was hard enough going through a city alone, where you didn't know what would crawl out and when. You also have to distinguish between what's pretending to be dead and what isn't. But the girl tried to cheer the guy up by praising him for quickly grasping the point. But there was no time for a very long rest, so already we must get up and continue our journey. With a bloody axe, he began hacking away at the iron door, saying that as much as Seo Jinsu had only imagined it, but this whole journey was actually a lot crazier than it should have been. He needed to hack into the production automation protocol. Artemis explained that there was no other choice, surveillance cameras couldn't be used, and the brunette knew it, that hacking device the girl had given him could only disable them. If one so recklessly messed with top-level security equipment, one could accidentally lock himself in here. They got close to a huge iron control panel with a bunch of lights on it. The guy opened the panel and started picking at wires and levers. He knew what to do. He kept thinking about what about the fire sensors. Seo Jinsu picked up and pushed aside a huge piece with wires trailing behind it. Given the nature of the confined space, the shelter is fully equipped with fire detection sensors. All sensors are interconnected, with translators that are replaced throughout the base. It's also the latest model that scans the air to detect unidentified substances. He asked about whether the robot understood what her partner was saying, and she only replied that the programming was complete, so it was better to let it continue than to say anything here. Seo Jinsu pointed a remote radio at the insides of the shield. The scanning began. The girl started her hologram, and now didn't understand what the brunette was doing, or rather, where such skills came from, so she wondered if it was his military training. And that's exactly what happened. The manager spent 6 years at the front as a military engineer. As he got used to it, he became the commander of the 2nd Unit of the Squadron of Objects of Capture of South Korea. An inscription on the robot appeared on the capture objects, special number 165. With her usual slightly arrogant look, the blonde girl commented on everything going on as a unit specializing in hacking and capturing automated equipment. The brunette continued to say that even on the battlefield, while the bullets were flying under his nose, Seo Jinsu was able to successfully carry out a break-in operation and get out. The situations were quite standard. Meanwhile, gaining control of the fire sensors had been completed. Artemis has updated the sensors so that they track the particles that infected people exhale and produce. Now the location of infected people will be sent to the PDA in real time. The manager recoiled, saying it was enough and it was done just perfectly. He thanked Artemis for her help, and she picked on the words, reasoning that the expressions enough and perfect couldn't stand in the same sentence. She was very strict and demanding. For her, only the perfect should exist. And Seo Jinsu simply ignored these whims and changed the subject, leaving their location to the fact that there were still far fewer monsters than he had expected. And the girl simply explained that this was the middle sector. In fact, the factories, except for the on-duty workers at the facilities. The guy looked at his electronic bracelet. He wondered what the nearest yellow dot on the screen was. It was an object whose identity had not yet been identified, releasing a certain amount of particles, so only when the brunette looked himself would he recognize it. And when they came to this place, there lay the body of the infectious. This picture made it funny, as if the body thought they would fall for a type of dead enemy a second time. Artemis scanned all around. There's no way around it. This type is blocking the way, and there are no other infected nearby. so there's one sure option. And Jinsu understood what his companion was getting at. He needed to kill the monster in front of him, and he could not refuse his madam. So he took the axe in his hand tighter. The monster on the here side of the wall hissed and crackled very loudly. Seo Jinsu had been scanning the door with his machine, and had seen the creature behind it himself, but her assistant had decided to warn the added target was only 2 meters away, so to in a row. Their movements indicate that they are unaware of their existence. No other threats were found nearby, so the order was very simple, had to be sorted out very quickly. And then that very moment, when my heart starts beating at an incredible pace and then abruptly stops, right when the door opened. The monster didn't have time to react much, only to turn around, and immediately any image in his eyes disappeared. Immediately his head was blown off by Seo Jinsu with the sharp blade of his axe. All of his insides fell out. He flew past as if he had done nothing. He glanced around to accurately assess whether he could overpower his opponent. Anger coursing through him. There was another target ahead that also had to be destroyed, so he rushed towards another infectious one. The brunette was already standing in a more relaxed posture, for there were already 2 corpses behind him, and now he was asking his assistant about whether she hadn't asked him to avoid fights as much as possible, and now she demanded to exterminate the monsters. The girl justified that there was not enough information at that time, both about Seo Jinsu's actual abilities and the location of the enemies. But that's not the situation now, and it would have to happen at some point. Now the guy can burst forward fast enough within a controlled range, but the manager didn't seem to hear what he was being told anymore. He was moving on. Artemis turned to the bow, drawing his attention to something worth noting. Namely that at 10 o'clock, about 11 meters behind the host, a yellow object, and Seo Jinsu glanced at his pocket personal computer. In front of him lay a corpse, dead from the looks of it, the body completely unmoving and showing no sign of activity. But even so, Seo Jinsu struck the flesh of the one who posed an obstacle and potential danger with his axe. And now he realized it was another mutant pretending to be dead. They didn't seem to be as stupid as they looked. But Artemis quickly debunked this theory, saying that it was not a pretense, but rather a state of hibernation. Anyway, the girl thought that there were no more corpses or infected people in the area, which was why recognizing particles in the air wasn't accurate. Seo Jinsu said that if anything, they could just shoot them and that's it. He thought it was easy, and he liked that the guy could have a hand in it all. And the assistant asked to stay in the same positive spirit. They moved forward, straight to their destination, without loss of life or much expense in overpowering their enemies. The brunette was very close to the mid-sector control room, but he didn't remember any such obstacles being marked on the map. The robot suggested that apparently those engineers weren't taken by surprise either. Seo Jinsu was thinking about something, his gaze frowning and focused, something that clearly couldn't keep him calm. And Artemis asked to be connected to the nearest hosts and cranes that could be seen from here. The guy pointed his machine at the forklift and did a synchronization of the driving system. Immediately, the robots kicked in and started moving huge things. It was just as cool as Seo Jinsu thought. He couldn't even believe that when moving several large sheets of metal at the same time, not a single metallic sound could be heard. But just the fact that you can't open a welded door with hacking, and asked in order to change his partner's mind. And she said it was too stupid a question. The guy already had his welding mask on. He was very pleased to have all the tools here, very close, power low. The girl marveled at the fact that the brunette was so experienced at doing it, still handling the edges so naturally. And the man explained that it was all due to the fact that he had once been an asset and did it as often as he ate. But this caused defeat, because before this partner said that he was a commander but also found an answer to this, since Seo Jinsu is a military engineer. In order to develop the right skills, you had to do everything by yourself. In the front lines, there was still a reward for this. Except now it was wondering why the guy had changed jobs. According to his activity records, at 40 he would have earned the rank of general. The guy was silent for a while. He certainly wanted to live in honor and respect, so it was just the way it was when he signed up for the asylum staff. He was then in his military uniform sitting in front of a man in a black suit and a strict suit, with a briefcase on the table between them. Seo Jinsu said he was insulted by such offers. After all, he didn't come here for money. But Artemis reminded him that he had said so, but there was too much money to refuse, and the bow would not deny it. In the end, to exchange everything for a special future that also implies uninterrupted support, Remembering that moment, a picture of them standing near a huge door in the form of a trapdoor appeared in front of their eyes. And as soon as the entrance opened, all the emotions that were in his soul, from shock to admiration, appeared on Seo Jinsu's face. And in the end, the support he mentioned cost him his life and led to the situation they were in now. Artemis, on the other hand, didn't understand what was wrong, saying that it seemed like a very good exchange to her, and Seo Jinsu couldn't show that he was disappointed, so he agreed with the artificial intelligence with a smile. The guy had just stopped his work on opening the door. He crouched down, gave notice that he was ready, and began to open the passage. For now, asked not to interrupt the connection to the payloader. And then he noticed his companion's strange reaction. He wanted to talk about the fact that he still wasn't sure if more effort would be needed, but he himself suddenly turned his head toward the open gate, and then shock froze on his face and took away his speech. In front of him were ruins and a pile of infectious corpses with limbs torn off. Things looked much worse here than where they had been recently, horror creeping under his skin. A couple of them were moving forward on the bridge. It looked like those who had been caught off guard here were fighting to the last man. There were only remnants of the barricades around, and the fighters too. Artemis said that apparently the fighters couldn't block all three sides leading out of the control tower. The infected must have swarmed in from every crevice. Now it made sense why he hadn't seen any high-powered equipment outside. It was all here, inside. The brunette looked around. No fuel left at all. From the looks of it, the battle was very desperate and not at all easy. Artemis began scanning, and once everything was more or less ready, she ran a simulation to replay the situation. Now one could see the frightened faces of those who had tried to defend themselves here long ago. They defended themselves on the only road outside of the control room. From a tactical standpoint, as Artemis had said, it was the best choice, but the situation had turned out horribly. Barricade the first row, and in addition, flamethrowers blocked the way, and if a gap formed, eliminated with a high-power torch. And also crushed from above or pushed away with the bucket of an excavator. Seo Jinsu tried to piece together every single fact. He glanced at the floor. Judging by the body count, it was obvious they had held on for a long time, but they were still dead, so it was just a futile hope. The goggles were scanning everything. Simulation creation was taking place. The causes of the damage were being figured out. The break in the defense seemed to have started right where the guy was standing, and so the loading of the model was completed. Soon appeared, and the cause of the damage was the fall of an unknown large volume and mass object. Something quickly and violently ripped through the back rows. A particularly cohesive defense collapse, and a huge panic and then disaster descended upon the people first. They had to fight off those who were already infected with whatever they could. One was spraying his enemies with a special device, but the mutants were getting closer and closer. But at one point something went wrong, and now it was just a pile of remains from a human body that had been torn into small pieces, and now it was all lying under folk and monsters included. Seo Jinsu looked at all of this with anxiety inside. It's hard to imagine how the laborers felt back then. Even in the worst situation, using all their strength and skills, everyone fought until the very end, and no one could then think that something would go wrong. Artemis also seemed to regret everything that had happened here, but still didn't seem too distracted by what had happened in the past without abandoning her original goal. And so the front door to the central control room was successfully breached with the same device. This was the finish line they were about to cross. The drone scanned the room, and there were no living objects inside, but no signs of forced entry either. Seo Jinsu turned to Artemis, saying that now was the time to show the intruders who really owned the place, so they should open it as soon as possible, before this mood passed. I still couldn't believe it was an infection. It was a nightmare. It just can't be called a normal infection. The ones Seo Jinsu knew about were something like a rash or cough, not turning people into monsters. There's no telling now how long the quarantine in the asylum has lasted, even all the craziness from the radio with phone calls from the quarantine lower sector, the unthinkable videos and internet posts that were uploaded from all over the world. And now it's all stopped. The speaker at that time still did not realize the same situation outside as they had inside. First of all, they gathered in the control tower of the central sector. All the workers we could contact arrived. The unknown author of the audio recording was taking notes, just in case, and was incredibly annoyed that he didn't understand what was going on. The guy stopped listening to the diary entry and headed over to the huge screen where everything had changed, and now he was interested in what Artemis was trying to do. The girl herself appeared on the display and said that she was engaged in the work of isolating the vectors. She was doing this starting with the infected on their way to the lower sector. That's when the manager asked if there was anything he could do to help in this situation, to which he received a negative answer. She advised he better get a good night's rest and conserve his strength. The lower quadrant was much bigger than this, and then asked about whether she should turn off the lights, but Seo Jinsu refused. He just wants to rest in silence, waving his hand away. They turned on an audio recording from Kim Yeon-soo, recording number 9. He talked in it about now being at the outer wall, a heavily guarded control tower. The man had managed to team up with other working-class guys. They were building guardrails on the main bridge of the control tower and also at all 3 gates. But the situation, he was not afraid to admit, was hopeless. Over 80% of the workers had died soon after the quarantine began. Much had changed. The brunette listened intently to everything. About then, human casualties steadily increasing in pursuit of these monsters. A picture began to appear in front of his eyes as the man ran, carrying himself with all his legs. The workers were isolated and were getting into position, for their opponents were advancing and about to be close by. The mutants were screaming and attacking. The defenders didn't know what to do. There were too many of them. The chief ordered the work to cease, and to immediately lower the barricade and close the blockade. All others who would be uninvolved should prepare for the offensive. Already the fighters should have prepared flamethrowers for battle, blocking infectious access all the way. But a subordinate couldn't do that, because that one was Menjin himself. Their former comrade ran at them. Only his recognizable face was left. The commander was furious, because this is no longer human and must be killed. You cannot get back his human form. Therefore, if they didn't want to lose the rest of their comrades, they should fire as quickly as possible. And the subordinates still opened fire on the monsters that were rushing towards them. With the fever already spreading through the infected, they received a new order to get the hell out of here as quickly as possible. One of the men was very sick. Before that he was very panicked and screaming, which prevented him from concentrating. And now he was vomiting. And this prevented them all from running away. So the worker asked the supervisor to see what was happening to their colleague. Except that the commander was a little distracted, but as soon as he heard what was going on, he immediately stopped voicing his complaints about being distracted. The problem was that it was always dark in the upper sector. But now it was completely different. The man held up his helmet and looked over the top. There was a lantern burning. They were now assuming that the jerk had survived, the one who'd gone upstairs to install some sort of supercomputer, and then he'd been cut off from them and seemed to have gotten something in the end. Now they were starting to remember that the guy had mentioned and that he had once been a special forces man, but now an engineer, and it would be really nice to have him here with them. But it was better this way, to know that at least someone else had survived. And afterward, the commander asked why all the workers just stand around chilling. Better let them weld the doors to number 1. And then they heard on the audio track that they found something else on. And then the recording ended. This strained Seo Jinsu. This is not the full information he wanted to hear and draw some conclusions. But still, the efforts of those workers were not in vain. Thanks to them the central sector's dispatch station is fixed, although it cost a huge number of casualties. He looked at the icons with the names of the workers. The red screen said the foreman was dead, but the entire plaque was dotted with the names of the workers and they were all dead or with vital functions failing. There were no survivors. There were notes with transcripts by the console, and next to it information that if there was an outbreak among internal staff, then quarantine and report it. Seo Jinsu asked to turn on the next recording. Meanwhile a robot was already coming towards him, silently but quickly. Artemis considered his morale, though he didn't mention not, but his thoughts were interrupted just as the mechanism was approaching him. On the tray was a cup with a hot drink, offering a drink and some cheer. A bright light appeared near the drone, a flash that heralded the arrival of the assistant. Artemis carefully sat down on the robot and asked his partner about why he was not resting now, although he was going to do so, and the brunette answered by drinking a delicious coffee. On the battlefield it was always was a rest, namely checking the combat logs of other squads with a cup of delic. And then he realized that he had been drinking black coffee all this time, and almost spit out what was in his mouth. And the girl replied that there could be no other way, because the manager had already consumed enough calories. And pure sugar only intensifies the unpleasant secretions of human primitive skin. Seo Jinsu had no words for this situation. Then Artemis didn't try to apologize for such a prank and only showed the hologram, ordering him to look carefully if he wanted to get really useful information. Now, for example, starting with the tape that she just turned on, where there is evidence of an unidentified huge object, the Kyongsu tape, the last tape, advised to turn on from the 32nd minute. There the man said that gate number to also crucify, putting in the warden's report that those monsters pile in all at once, had to gather. After setting up the flamethrower, decided to let the harpooners finish it off. They were supposed to conserve as much fuel as they could. But there's a very loud sound. The sound level track was just frantic. At the highest point, it seemed that the wave from this sound could also knock down through the screen. Only swearing was heard and that was the end of the recording. The sound subsided, nothing else, just silence. Artemis said that, as expected, it was an unusual specimen that a guy couldn't handle on his own. If he came across one, he better, as the girl recommended, bypass such a one, remaining unnoticed. And the reason for that is that there's nothing on the security cameras in the central sector. There's a good chance he's gone down to the lower sector. The brunette then asked about the work to isolate the infected. That's what the drones were doing. But the artificial intelligence interrupted him, saying there was nothing. And since Seo Jinsu was so interested, let him take a look at everything himself. The little robot moved forward on the road ahead. The monsters rushed right at him, opening their jaws wide in readiness to devour anything that moved. But the mechanical creation managed to dodge and turn the corner before he could still be grabbed, and began to go faster. Except that the infected turned and sped after that car just like that, not realizing they couldn't get enough. They were very stupid and infantile, only growling and lunging at anything living. But here's the trouble. The mechanical door slammed shut behind them. It was only now that the mutants realized it was a trap when the door slammed shut intentionally in front of them as well. Now they were imprisoned. Every step, every movement, was tracked on screens, both schematically and by cameras. Seo Jinsu analyzed everything. It was more like a game of catch-up. Artemis said that there were still similar operations going on in 39 other locations right now, and then asked about whether he wanted to check it out. But the brunette didn't feel much like it. And how was he even supposed to do that? He wasn't an artificial intelligence like his friend. The girl remembered it. Though she didn't forget it, she just allowed reservations, and then asked the guy to stop worrying about things that were beyond him and let him better get his act together properly. The plan was to have the isolation work completed within 40 minutes. Seo Jinsu realized what he had been told. Dan sighed in relief. After putting a black mask over his face and asking about how Artemis was going to deal with the infected in isolation, the blonde said she wanted to close the exits to suffocate them and get rid of them with a production incinerator, and the guy thought it was a great idea. Then suddenly he turned to his partner. Very suddenly and unexpectedly. He didn't open his eyes, just ordered to use the highest power of fire to burn all the enemies to the ground. Seo Jinsu was about to leave. He was seen off by everyone together. A turnaround was ordered for the commander who was departing. There weren't many soldiers, but even if there were two, it would be nice. The guys put their hands to their heads as a sign of respect. The brunette only laughed a little. He didn't understand why he had to stand at attention when no one was really shooting. But anyway, they all done a great job. He himself wasn't exactly happy about this sudden dismissal, but it had to be done. He was now traveling on a huge warship, on a seemingly endless sea, with seagulls flying overhead and talking loudly about something. If you think about it that way, the timing was just perfect. Being an officer walking around the battlefield, the fact that he was able to advance in rank while keeping his life was thanks to at least some jamming operations and a small-sized battlefield with only localized combat levels. Suddenly behind his back a child's squeaky voice turned to his father. He was very glad they were almost there. In the child's hands was a small brochure inviting him to visit the construction site, but suddenly the wind snatched the paper from his hands and carried it high into the sky. And his father stroked his son's head, not letting it worry him too much. It was as if the big birds were pointing the way, and this world where a young child comes to build a shelter with his family is too cruel. A man in a strict suit opened a briefcase and said that the situation now is not the easiest, or rather almost completely catastrophic. The countdown to the beginning of the World War has already begun, and their organization thinks very highly of Seo Jinsu's skills as a major, which is why he ended up here and was approached. And then he asked about whether Mr. Major would really take like that and go into the thick of the war that was about to break out. That the black suitcase contained not money, as it might at first appear, nor weapons, but a couple of pieces of paper. And the brunette understood that his risky action was a way to save himself, a business plan written on one of the pieces of paper, a private urban disaster operations center. Money is money. But a particular premonition also played a part in the decision, and the decision was clear and positive. The two men shook hands in agreement. There was a discussion going on underground between two workers. One felt that the disaster prevention system should be installed as carefully as possible. He shouted that his interlocutor didn't know how vulnerable an enclosed space could be, but he was interrupted by a colleague who brought the chief manager information about the contract for the computer control system, as he had requested. Everyone was surprised when they heard about Artemis, because they remembered that it was the development they wanted to use for the foundation of the moon base, and would likely come to them right before the construction was completed. Seo Jinsu did send a request, but didn't think they'd send something so massive. The question was how much it was even worth, but here they were interrupted by another coworker, and asked to see the news. Everyone stuck to the monitor, and Seo Jinsu's expectations were completely met. A man in an expensive suit stood behind a podium with a bunch of microphones and addressed the citizens. And hearing that mankind is no longer alone in the universe just took away everyone's tower of speech, only numbness. Seo Jinsu was especially shocked. Things had unfolded in a way the guy couldn't have expected. And a few months later, he saw a warning to initiate emergency lockdown protocol, immediately close gates in all compartments, implement emergency security measures to protect priority facilities, and such was Artemis, suddenly cut off any possibility of access. Sudden isolation before the work is even fully completed. Emergency isolation protocol is only followed in extreme emergencies, but the brunette wasn't particularly worried about being locked out. Started thinking calmly about how he should be. Since it couldn't be launched by accident or mistake, it could be a terrorist attack or a surprise attack by an enemy country. And then he realized that if that was true, he was now alone in the entire upper sector. The lockdown would not stop until his cause was eliminated. Then Seo Jinsu would be left in this room utterly helpless and without any chance of life. The anxiety was too close to becoming visible, so you need to calm down as quickly as possible. A place completely cut off from the outside world, for one thing, with his credentials and this equipment, and it's just not possible to open this room and take down the protocol. Then all he had to do was enlist Artemis' help, which was very risky. After all, this artificial intelligence was not yet connected to the hardware. It was a huge jungle thing with wires. Initially, the whole process would have taken about a week, but there's nothing left to do but try to get something done. And then the third day came. He could barely connect Artemis. Seo Jinsu managed to open one of the heavily guarded doors. The guy immediately rushed over there in search of water and started just pouring it down his stomach to at least take away the hellish thirst he had gathered. And then he turned toward the huge screen, and what he saw face to face was simply horrifying. The highest level biological contamination warning appeared in the middle and lower sector. The emergency isolation protocol was initiated. This was actually the most unexpected outcome of the situation. And then the voice from afar that addressed Jins got louder and louder, as if getting closer, and at one point became unbearably loud, which made him wake up. The brunette was interested in what was wanted from him at the moment, and Artemis wondered what the dream was about, or if it was Seo Jinsu faking it so skillfully. The guy just leaned back and tried to pull his thoughts together and become more disinhibited. After a couple minutes, coming to his senses, replied that the dream was about how he described Artemis' desktop computer. And then with his side vision, the guy saw the little robot shaking with anger. Such a thing was hard not to notice, especially when the girl rose into the air and began to illuminate everything around her with a red light. It raised questions about whether such an event was normal. And the artificial intelligence replied that it didn't look like a calm being at all, so one could already guess that Artemis hadn't forgotten the way her partner had humiliated her back then. It was already really scaring Seo Jinsu, so it was better to stop it before it was too late. The robot's eye only glowed harder. She remained silent and made no concessions. But immediately she lessened her anger, saying that the guy was right. A higher intelligence should show understanding, especially to someone who had been locked up for 3 whole days. That is why, when the various obstacles that the manager struggled with disappeared, the elements and inorganic salts that were repressed in the young man's body would go nowhere. Seo Jinsu sincerely apologized for what happened then. It's true that it's a very awkward moment, but What happened, happened. And the brunette promised it wouldn't happen again, though the robot doubted it. And since that's the case, the first thing to do, starting with cutting out the urethra after the mission. But here the manager found a certain plate, and wondered what it was. Artemis explained that this armored plate is an extra security measure that the asylum police used. After reviewing the records of the EMTs on call at the time of the incident and collecting all surveillance footage, the girl went on to say that in the case of walkers, it could be said that there was no intelligence, and Seo Jinsu didn't understand what was meant by the meaning of walkers, and got the explanation that they were regular infected, and the name robot just made up. And then back to the topic of conversation because, for what it's worth, it seems like the general trend has been to look for vital points. If a guy wears one, he'll suffer a lot less. Seo Jinsu agreed because it even gives him confidence, so thanked him for such a gift, and the girl ordered him to come out as soon as he was ready. The guy came out in full uniform to the gloomy expanse and asked about the effectiveness of the insulation being reliable. Artemis analyzed everything and the time was completely blank, so there were no markings on his device on his arm. His companion summarized that the operation was quick, and yes, the influx would have been less dense anyway. And then, I decided to warn you in advance that during the emergency lockdown, the lower sector had 16 times as many residents as the upper sector. They were standing over a huge city whose life had simply frozen, vanished, as if nothing was there. Artemis added that there will be no more freedom of movement like there has been so far, which creates more problems. It didn't scare Seo Jinsu, it only made him excited. At least he tried to show it by saying that it was good news, or he was getting bored. And the robot willingly believed it, which means less problems with the whole thing. And since they have such a fighting spirit, they should finally make up their minds and go down, raring to fight. The computer had completed the transfer of control of the fire sensors in the lower sector, and at this point, the number of confirmed infected was simply enormous, beyond the capacity of a normal human. A sea of red dots burned on the monitor. There were 2,325 enemies in total, and it was necessary to plot a route to minimize the amount of skirmishes as much as possible, and the number of them was increasing by the minute. The operation to recognize all the objects would take some time, understandably, but it seemed to Jinsu that there was something wrong with this number if 2/3 of those living were infected. The aide explained that everything happened before the work was done, so that's why the numbers are what they are. If it had happened after the residents had moved in, it would have been different. She opened the holographic map and explained that the numbers would reach into the tens of thousands. The map was downtime dotted with red. The guy lowered himself to the floor for a little breather. It was clear now that they had just gotten very lucky in this situation. Either way, at this point, the four opponents the brunette had just dealt with could be removed from the list. In the narrow alley of this large underground city, a head could be seen peeking out from one of the doors. Seo Jinsu tried to scout the surroundings nearby. The sounds from the monsters didn't stop, so there was someone nearby. He quietly ran over behind the pipe and asked Artemis to take her time and be a little quieter so as not to give away their location. Running over, Seo Jinsu discussed the problem of not being able to see hibernating objects at all on his pocket personal computer. He asked if there was anything that could be done about it, otherwise things would go badly. The robot replied that most likely some way to recognize their energy could be found. But now was not the time. We needed to get away quickly. At the moment, the girl suspected that there was an overly high density of infected near the hydroponics plants. As they moved through the alleys below, even mutants were prowling the rooftops. And just as the topic of hydroponics plants confused Seo Jinsu, they are, according to previous information, meat-eaters alone. There was a nasty infestation in front of him, which he swung his sharp axe at. He cut it into two halves, and without blinking an eye, as if nothing had happened, asked about the fact that, if he remembered correctly, there was a fusion reactor nearby. And then he admitted that, frankly speaking, he would like to look at it once. It was interesting how they managed to eat vegetables, and the companion asked not to risk making assumptions that have no confirmation. Still, the priority goal is to gain control of the lower sector. So until then, the guy needs to survive in the obligatory order. So it's worth focusing on those enemies right in front of you. And there were an awful lot of them. Those monsters gathered near the huge screen that was broadcasting the emergency lockdown notification. Not even the most fearless person would go near them, so Seo Jinsu also asked Artemis to find a W. But the robot quite unexpectedly for the guy himself answered that at the moment this was the safest way, and such a thing was very hard to believe, but then the girl pointed in the other direction. According to the outdoor advertising show list, in 21 seconds there will be a showing of a commercial that has resulted in a large number of complaints about loud noise, and given that the infected are concentrated near the screen, in the 15 seconds while the commercial plays, it's likely the guy can get past them relatively safely. The only obstacles were two walkers on the way, but they would be dealt with, as it was actually before. And then the girl added that it was necessary to start moving on her signal. Suddenly the screen went blank for 1 second, or rather one commercial ended, and that small moment of silence was very tense. The monsters froze, waiting to see what would happen next, though there was a thought that they were about to get bored and turn around, in an attempt to get away, and noticed the one who was hiding almost behind their backs. And then the music started playing loudly. I wanted to cover my ears with my hands. The monitor turned bright blue, blinding my eyes. From there, the question of whether the citizens were frightened by the threat of war that all the newspapers were talking about, and what they thought about the punishment from outer space that conspiracy theorists were talking about, offered a very different taste of survival. Now was the perfect moment. Artemis signaled for the guy and he rushed to run past the monsters, running around behind their backs, but still keeping them in sight, controlling their every move. The girl said there were two walkers 9 meters ahead to the right and 15 meters to the left, so we should be ready. She showed the diagram and added that let the intersection of the two properties overlap with the structure, so it is worth starting on the right. In a spurt, Seo Jinsu firmly grabbed his knife and pulled it out with a sharp movement. Very symbolically, at the sound of cheers to the shelter from that huge TV with the commercials, the guy stabbed the infected so that the blade went through and out the mouth, spurting out a lot of blood. At the same sounds from the big screen, the manager rushed to the second, who only now smelled something wrong, but it was a little late, although there was still a chance to remain unharmed. The lad swung around and with a leap showed the monster who was master of this hideout, displaying his most formidable look and an equally powerful punch. The rest of the mutants were still near the screen like zombies. They were reaching for him, didn't understand what the people on the screen were telling them, didn't even seem to distinguish them from the real ones, and wanted to tear them apart. It was only now that Seo Jinsu concentrated on what was coming from the TV. He hadn't heard this speech in too long, but it still seemed like a complete absurdity. Who even gave permission for such a thing? Artemis remained silent. She turned the topic to the fact that thanks to this, they had it led. 10 meters ahead towards the near side of the wall were two walkers that were moving, according to the calculations of the artificial intelligence, and if going, do it right now, the soldier only replied unquestioningly that he understood everything. The girl told the truth to her face that Seo Jinsu could not break through the thousands of infected. The streetcar line must be used. And according to the fire sensors, the total number of objects inside is 6 pieces, 3 in the corridor and 2 on the platform. She turned on the map visibility. Arethmus wasn't sure if they were attracted to the train that stopped here regularly. All the objects were facing the tracks. Her partner thanked her for the information and said there shouldn't be a problem with the elimination, that he was still concerned about whether the subway was supposed to work that way. It was too dark, to which he got the answer that it was just a circuit breaker that had failed. But there was no problem with the traffic. The girl was completely oblivious to the fact that the functioning of human eyes is so primitive, and then abruptly turned to the guy and asked if he needed a light source by any chance, hinting at yet another horrible surgery in a normally healthy body, which naturally Seo Jins didn't like. So the manager asked not to make jokes like that again, though he knew that such a topic of conversation would be brought up again after some time. And then he asked whether the senses of infected people worked the same way as in humans, or at least close to it. He knew that yes. He just tried to chop. The guy's glasses lit up greenish, activating his night vision, and he made the point that he just couldn't pass up the opportunity to gain a one-sided advantage. He could clearly see his targets, those horrible infected, and standing next to one just like him, only with hair. It seems he hadn't fully become like the others yet, but his great similarity to the man shouldn't give a sense of pity. Artemis, on the other hand, didn't stop Seo Jinsu from such a sudden attack, but she didn't think things would go very smoothly after talking like that. But the guy didn't hear her anymore, but rushed forward, gathering all his strength. The infected heard a stomping sound behind him and turned as fast as he could at the sound. Realizing it was a potential danger, his opponent was already killing one of his own kind. Thrusting his huge, sharp axe into it, but the monster wasn't going to run away, even with how easily the warrior was dealing with them. And there was no time to do anything. His head also flew off very quickly, leaving behind only a small stream of blood. And Seo Jinsu didn't stop, only ran forward. These things were too nasty. The guy asked about whether there would now also be pregnant women among the infected, but he heard nothing in response but advised to take a breath and continue the elimination all the way to the third station. And it would only be possible to fully rest once the operation was over and everything was taken care of. And Seo Jinsu didn't mind that. He wanted to say that if you stayed here too long, you could get claustrophobic, but he was interrupted by something that got in his face. Artemis was worried about him. The axe flew from his hands, rattling loudly across the floor. That's something right to go through the mask, and the brunette was trying to get the monster off of him. This was an unusual creature and dropping it was necessary right now. Seo Jinsu reminded him that he didn't have to be told that. He already knew something had to be done about it. Artemis looked at the pregnant infected. Realizing it was all about her, something was bursting out of her and the guy had just managed to get the nasty creature out of her face. Seo Jinsu stomped on the mutant, spewing a vile slurry off of it, and the girl said that if what popped out now was most of it, that was the end of it. We need to get out of here as quickly as possible. But then we heard footsteps behind us and loud growls. As expected, their actions had made a lot of noise, and now the rest of the infected were coming for them. And if they could make it, we needed to get away as quickly as possible. Seo Jinsu made the decision to stand to the last and fight back. He reloaded his automatic rifle, clicking it loudly. But then he heard a terrible sound. He and the robot turned their attention to a pregnant infected woman. Something began to burst from her gut. It was a horribly nasty creature with a maw in the middle. It was much bigger from the one that had just attacked the guy. Seo Jinsu didn't believe they had managed to sweep so quickly, but he didn't think they'd be so bogged down on both sides. 3 walkers were chasing them, but it wasn't just these 3 horrible mutants that needed to be controlled. The guy looked at the pregnant woman's body, which had just become completely unrecognizable. He was shaking and wriggling more and more. Something was creeping outward right through his skin. It was eerie to look at the blood, sweat, and torn body. Not just one monster showed up from the woman, but 3 that were screaming and hissing loudly. I wanted to cover my ears to not hear the sound, but they were immediately exterminated. Seo Jinsu had no intention of leaving them alive, and so he immediately fired 3 bullets, 1 for each creature. He was proud of his fractional shot. Those sons of bitches deserved it, but it was worth moving on, because other mutants were already running at him. The ones that had already caught sight of the common enemy. Artemis advised her traveling companion and friend to run, and he knew without her that he should get his feet away, but the infected were very fast and that was all times 3. The mutant swung his huge arm, which should have just pierced through his enemy. Seo Jinsu managed to stun the monster with the machine gun right in the face. The monster recoiled backwards. One was already trying to move away from the blow, and the other one also apparently wanted to get hit in the head and was raring to fight. It was hard for the guy to keep track of all the targets, but he tried to do it. He was skilled at dodging attacks and striking back. His years of Turniervok had not been in vain. He reloaded his weapon once more. The sound was sweeter than honey to his ears. It meant the real mess was coming. Jinsu began aiming straight at his opponent, who was looming over him, in an attempt to jump up and devour him. The guy held his breath, and the bullet burst from the barrel straight into the target. The explosive force released a huge blast of fire directly into the head of the one who was trying to kill everyone. The recoil pinned him to the floor harder. Seo Jinsu spared the infected's head. Blood rushed out as if it was just filled with a balloon that suddenly burst. But while that already corpse was flying over the guy, he hit him on the head with his knee, thus pushing him forward. Because of that, the brunette fell down and was covered by the monster. He was very upset by the smells that crashed into his nostrils, and Artemis ordered him to gather himself as quickly as possible, because a third was on its way and that couldn't make Seo Jinsu happy. He clenched his teeth and prepared to start hammering away again. The infected with a bloated belly ran straight towards Seo Jinsu and stretched his hands forward to grab his victim quickly. Even though it was easy for the brunette, one or the other, it still amounted to trouble. But this one also managed to blow his head off, so it wasn't really worth worrying about. Or was it? And it was really worth worrying about, because immediately, he felt a strange sensation in his legs that made him wonder, and goosebumps pass over his skin. Even though the one who had just been killed and fallen off his feet was no longer a threat, The very first one had revived. It was like a wicked joke that he wished he had never seen or heard, much less been in that situation. He called out for Artemis, hoping she would help right now, for he had noticed a change in the behavior of that first monster. He stood up and with another scream began attacking the guy with more force. It was impossible to think in his mind how this infected survived under these conditions. An eye on his ugly face began to open, swollen, it seemed about to explode, spurting fluid outward. He swung his sharp arm right at his victim in the form of Sojinsu, but immediately Artemis came to the rescue, the drone flying closer. She was very fast, trying to do everything in time to save her friend and help her to get rid of the infected. The mutant didn't realize what was happening, and he was already blinded by the bright light that left glare on every sweat of his face. Such a moment provided the perfect opportunity to attack and embed his knife directly into the flesh of the infected, tearing the skin. But it wasn't deep enough to do any meaningful damage, and that seems to be a fatal flaw in this case. Anxiety increased, but there was enough sanity to start moving, crawling straight for the axe that lay nearby. Sojinsu got to his feet, holding his weapon in his right hand and looking straight at his opponent, who was still being hit by the guy's punch. Suddenly one paw of the infected began to twitch, clawing at the walls around it, and the other would strike a self-similar lying next to it, these country movements uncontrolled by the creature itself. To Sojinsu it seemed like something not as it should be. Artemis tried to explain it away by saying that the brain function was severely affected by the blow, and that's why such a reaction was caused. The brunette was shocked that the infected were now crawling on the ground, and the girl replied that this was an expected result after the guy had used a firearm, so we could abandon hopes of getting the knife back. Suddenly a cherished sound was heard, but not at this very moment. Sojinsu and the drone started to run away. The manager asked the girl about the arrival time of the streetcar and did it really come now, and the girl replied that 146 seconds later. It was pulling up to the P. The brunette realized it was taking too long. He wondered about whether they could change his speed to that of the express, but they couldn't do that yet because they didn't have the authority to control him. Sojinsu began scanning the space in front of him with a gun-like apparatus. The fact that the smoke was blocking their view was just great news to the two infiltrators. Artemis notified that the transfer of control of the streetcar line control system was complete, so she changed speed to express, and transportation would arrive in 31 seconds. All Jinsu had to do was hold out for a bit. He stood behind the wall and took aim at his enemies, keeping his distance. He couldn't see very clearly because of the smoke, but he could understand at least something, so he was as serious as ever. He kept his finger on the trigger, ready to strike at any moment, but then he heard the strange sounds of them growling. They didn't sound like normal, and what he saw only confirmed it. He saw how the three monsters he had interrupted did get to their feet and started attacking each other. Artemis asked what her partner saw there, and the latter explained that he thought their opponents were fighting, which was very strange. But it was a defeat for the drone itself as well. It would seem that the logical explanation would be that one's brain was broken, but here Sojinsu didn't think so. One infected man was making his way through the smoke. He wasn't moving fast, seemingly because he was injured. Its face was disfigured and very ugly, with the snarls and screams typical of these monsters coming out of its mouth. But then his head exploded, but not from Sojinsu's shot, but from someone's hand. It just crushed the monster. The couple saw the whole picture, and if Sojins managed to keep steadiness and balance inside, then Artemis was excited. They heard the announcement of the information that there was a verification of resident registration information going on. Very excited. There was a discrepancy in the system with that strange voice. A mechanical arm, blooded, slowly moved away from the body of the slain infected. It was a large robot with a glowing eye, and it recognized and confirmed its scans that there were intruders here. Sojinsu and his assistant hid back around the corner. They didn't understand what the security robot was doing here. The excitement was increasing. They have yet to recall even the leading asylum model producing such performance. Artemis suggested that the power restriction had been lifted. This level only applies to riots in correctional facilities, but the guy was shocked because it's impossible without using the government technician's access code. And artificial intelligence didn't deny that fact. It confirmed that it was indeed impossible. The robot, who was a danger to himself, spoke of a man standing in front of him, about 8 meters away. He spoke of the protagonist, who was trying on the contrary to somehow hide from this watcher. He asked the spotted strangers if they happened to be escorting an intruder, And Jinsu gave his opinion that they were even lucky if you think about it that way, because if they could get this guy with them, it would become many times easier. He explained to the dangerous guy about the system administrator, Seo Jinsu, that is him being here. And he's investigating the current situation. The robot didn't realize what was going on at first, and almost sparking, it cocked its head to the side, thus clarifying what she had just heard. Then the brunette took a sterner tone and said, more assertively, that the system manager, Seo Jinsu, was here and ordered the robot to stay put, and the machine obediently stopped following the command. Artemis asked to be more careful because the sound of central processing didn't sound quite normal, which meant that dysfunctions were expected, and Jinsu realized this already by the very sight of it. The guy pointed his scanning device directly at the robot in an attempt to figure out what was going on. After all, while the guy was trying to take matters into his own hands, the mechanical machine, which seemed to be out of control, grabbed his hand with hers, squeezing him painfully. Seo Jinsu was shocked at this turn of events. An unpleasant feeling traveled from his wrist to his shoulder. The robot seemed to go crazy and started talking about how the two were escorting trespassers and would be punished for that as well. He opened a huge mechanical mouth that portended danger for whoever stood before him. He was a little short-circuited. Speech was interrupted. He had begun the initiation of the process of verifying resident registration information, and he was already swinging a huge hand. But the robot didn't hit him, just took his hand firmly and said he hoped he would cooperate and offer no resistance. But that didn't mean he wouldn't attack with his other hand. Just the opposite. His eyes shone with a cold-bloodedness that was typical of a machine. Still told him not to resist and to give as much help as possible, if only by not moving during such an important process. The brunette was in great consternation because he remembered how this same robot had crushed the head of an infected man in one motion without much trouble. Because as soon as the iron hand descended on Seo Jinsu, he immediately dodged, preventing his body from being harmed. The guy couldn't understand why the machine was ignoring commands from the system administrator. It's just impossible. But there was definitely no time to think about that now, simply because the robot wasn't going to stop either. And if anything, the first order of business was to get the upper hand. And even that was too slow for such a difficult moment, simply because already the robot's fist had slammed into the man's stomach. A terrible pain went through all the organs inside. Seo Jinsu spat out blood. The taste of iron filled his mouth. And in addition to the pain there was also shock. His eyes grew very wide. So much had happened in the last couple minutes, much less a couple hours, as if all the disasters had decided to catch up at the same moment. The robot took the guy harder by the throat, not letting him inhale even a drop of air. And for all the cruelty, he asked very politely not to resist. But then a spark of the last hope of his salvation gleamed in his eyes, which was in his hands. The machine gun made that needed reloading sound. This was his chance to break free from the shackles of the iron hands. Seo Jinsu pointed the weapon straight at the enemy, but the shot went through his shoulder, only barely grazing the robot. His lifeless eyes, which were already glowing red, showed even more rage. Wires from his gut broke and sparks shot into the air, foreshadowing the fact that something more horrible could happen now due to the malfunction. The out-of-service robot's fist slammed right into the wall next to it, and could have hit Seo Jinsu's face if he hadn't dodged. The screen in front of his eyes said that he had damage to the main working hydraulic system, and his target right now was the guy right across from him, and he needed to be destroyed very quickly. But here Seo Jinsu was able to shoot his arm with an automatic rifle, putting a bullet right through him. That should have relaxed this fight a bit. The robot pulled back a little and pointed his firearm directly at the car, his eyebrows furrowed and serious, his fate now only in his hands. But even here he was unable to outplay the artificial intelligence. The machine swung its leg, struck back and simply swept Seo Jinsu off his feet, thus causing him to slip across the floor. The boy was trembling in pain and trying to cover the impact site with his hand, which was completely covered in blood. Artemis was finally able to fly over to her traveling companion in concern. The robot warned of minor damage to the hydraulic system and was about to start a calibration count. And the girl on the guy's side expressed her view that the opponent's area was too small to be able to make effective strikes with Seo Jinsu's armament. Just then a horn sounded announcing that the train had arrived. They needed to get their feet away as quickly as possible, and Artemis reminded the brunette that completing the mission and the guy's survival were top priorities. The guy reached for his makeshift pistol, which had been helping all this time in scanning the environment, but there was no time to discuss it. They had to get away as quickly as possible, because the robot had already started counting, so Artemis should have given the train the command to depart as soon as they ran inside. Now the notice that the train was leaving sounded, and the machine pointed its sights at the lad and saw in him its purpose, which it had been pursuing all along. When his calibration count was almost complete, he tried to catch Seo Jinsu, who had already jumped into the subway car. To goodness, the wagon door pinned the robot down and prevented it from jumping in with the scouts and destroyers of the infected. There was another warning from the loudspeakers asking for everyone to move away from the doors, but it had no effect on the machine, which was trying to open the sliding doors with iron hands. The glass on them had already started to crack, so there was no point in waiting until the entrance was completely clear and Seo Jinsu rushed forward through the carriages just to avoid running head-on into the creepy machine again. Artemis wasn't sure their plan would work out, but the guy was confident that everything would go right, at least it should. Still, no matter how it was, Seo Jinsu had already dealt with a security robot a couple times in the past, so the experience was there. The loudspeaker rang once more, and the train moved. The only problem was that he was not alone and the weapon was much more suitable. And then this monologue was interrupted by a robot, which still managed to get inside the transport. The enemy seemed to look even more intimidating, and in addition assured that resistance was futile. With each step his speed increased, his heavy feet thudding loudly on the floor of the train. Despite Seo Jinsu firing at the robot, the bullets didn't do any good. It just bounced off the hands the guard was using to cover himself. Though the damage was there, but not critical, the machine had time to remind her that it had been urging her to cooperate all along. The brunette noticed a rather interesting detail. He slid the gun behind his back and hit it, namely that when guard robots are under fire attack, they protect their neck as it is their vital point. Then he took up his axe and decided that in such a case, the first thing to do was to attack in one of his hands. He swung around and knocked his opponent's arm away like it was just some paper and not a huge pile of iron. The wires have broken, the center of gravity will change urgently, and there may be a problem in the net while trying to protect the central electrical circuitry, namely that there would be no way to use his remaining hand, which was already a small victory. And then Seo Jinsu's eyes widened. The danger was already too close. The robot tried to strike, but the guy managed to fend off the attack and put up a block with his weapon. The brunette was shaking completely. Such a blow was hard to endure. Something urgent needed to be thought of before he was completely crushed. The look of the car was just staggeringly dangerous. The place where the arm used to be was sparking. It was like a real bloody killer in front of his next victim. Unlike the assumptions that the second arm couldn't work, the reality was quite different, and the limb swung straight at Seo Jinsu and hit its target. The guy only cared about one question: how to get rid of the guard. He was shivering on the floor, trying to catch his breath. He didn't even have a chance to get close to the vital point. While the brunette was picking himself up almost piece by piece, the mechanical guard was getting closer to him with each step. The manager looked around, checking what was going on behind his back and how he would need to defend himself, if anything. The robot was shaking all over from overexertion and still with the same bare-faced urging the manager to cooperate, even though he was well aware that he would kill whoever was under his feet right now. Artemis couldn't do much, but she tried to help in any way she could, because as soon as she saw the slightest chance of escape, she immediately notified Jinsu to grab the handrail on the side. The guy gripped the bar with his hand and tried to finalize what to do next. While the robot was trying to deliver another blow right on Seo Jinsu's face, the girl caused an emergency braking of the train. The iron hand was incredibly close to the guy, about to cause irreparable injuries, like a feathered nose or worse. The wheels began to spark from the braking, and eerie sound began to creep into the very depths of my ears. From such a sudden and violent overload, the robot fell on its back and began scratching the floor with its iron, scrambling toward the end of the car. As soon as the train stopped, Seo Jinsu looked back. The consternation was still the same in his eyes. He didn't know what to do or what was wrong with his opponent now. The guard, trembling, began to rise slowly, first kneeling down to stare at the one who had given him such a jolt. Artemis tried to reason with the guy, asking why he was standing there like a statue if she'd knocked out the maximum amount of time for her partner. And it only now came to the manager's attention that his girlfriend had done it. He thanked his artificial intelligence. It was because of this prank that Seo Jinsu would finally be able to finish off the robot. The brunette was already tired from the massacre with this guard, so he aimed his sights directly at his opponent, and this time, He wouldn't wait for the enemy to attack first. His finger pulled the trigger and the shot rang out immediately. Several shots. 6 bullets were heading straight for the tin can, which is assembled like a human being. Only this something is much scarier than normal humans. It has no feelings of sympathy or emotion. And one did hit the place it was supposed to hit. His neck, the most important part of his fake body. The wound immediately sparked and the system finally failed. He became dormant for a while. Strange noses began to erupt from the infernal machine, and every part of the assembly twitched. Seo Jinsu wasn't going to hesitate. He rushed forward towards the axe that was very close by. Now every phrase in which the robot called for cooperation made no sense and could be unheeded. The brunette ready to chop the rigid iron in half. Finally, this episode of their expedition would be over with. But the guy swept past the robot, going behind its back so as not to be visible, knowing full well that his opponent wouldn't have time to turn around so quickly. He braked his feet, abruptly and unexpectedly, barely holding on. But the manager knew what he was doing. Here is Seo Jinsu behind his enemy's back and already swinging a huge heavy blade to destroy the one who tried to destroy him. Eye for eye, blood for blood. All it took was one confident and sweeping blow, and the brunette had already done so, gathering all the strength in his trained hands, and there was the slap of metal against metal. The places on the neck above his back shimmered even more. The robot became immobilized. If he were human, this feeling would equate to convulsions. And then the very moment that Seo Jinsu had been waiting for so long happened. The guard's eye faded. He turned off. Unfortunately, the brunette didn't have time to properly calculate his trajectory and land successfully, falling to the floor and slipping some distance. Artemis immediately flew up, worrying about her faithful traveling companion and mission accomplisher. And the boy tried to catch his breath, least a little after such a stunt. The girl asked if the manager was injured and would be able to complete the operation. The man only slipped his finger up in agreement, saying that everything would be fine and done properly. Seo Jinsu was breathing heavily, trying to catch his breath. He couldn't believe that finally, this circle of hell was over. A loud sound and rumble filled the nearly empty carriage. The defeated ironclad fell to his knees. The sweat of blood on his shell caused fear. But there was nothing to fear. He wouldn't hurt anyone else. And after a couple seconds, the guard collapsed completely down, right next to his recent opponent, who was very happy inside from at least surviving and enjoying the moment of victory. The time for rest didn't last very long, because Artemis was already piling on the information that now that they had confirmed the existence of the different variants, they needed to be categorized, and from now on, the girl would tell Seo Jinsu as soon as she noticed even minor differences from them. All of this is to make sure you don't fall prey to such attacks again. Seo Jinsu clearly thought Artemis' pride was not badly damaged since she thought Samneel's attack on him was due to gaps in the briefing. The girl scanned the robot's head and, returning to the conversation, said that if you looked at the records left on the memory card, the infection mechanism was something like hacking into the system. Inside the head was a nest and wires made up of organisms. Then the guy had a logical question as to why his opponent then died. And he got the answer very quickly, because the brain was connected to this mechanism, which means that the system can conduct brain wiring. And while the hack spreads, the brain is fried by the influence of a counter program that fights back. And it was in this way that this, if you can call it that, infected person died. And the robot itself was completely engulfed by the infection in the settlement after picking it up. Artemis stopped her narration because that's all they had to endure so far up to this point, and Seo Jinsu clapped his hand on his knee, laughing, saying that the infection had evolved only to attack mechanical devices, straight up eye-rolling. To him it was just unexpected sentimentality, and the robot said that it was kind of the norm, because, as she remembered, it was the result of evolution. The girl reminded me that she wasn't interested in any speeches and word games along the lines that success is impossible without overcoming failure, but she would never just leave things alone. This greatly moved her partner, almost to tears. Such determination could not go unnoticed by him. With an icy voice and a stern look, Artemis declared that what she wanted was a temple, and she'd want more than just some ice pyramid left behind by humans, like the ones that already exist. Immediately after the lockdown, there was a huge panic in the lower sector of the shelter. Screams echoed throughout the neighborhood. As the robot attacked one man asking for help, the others ran as fast as they could to the worker's office. There are guard rifles there that they could use. The guard was squeezing his arm as hard as he could. He was doing a vital signs check. A relief operation was being performed. The robot was asking the person working to calm down, and the person was already barely breathing. The guard kept looking at the signs and appearance of the man. Veins swelled across his face, capillaries were bright red, though there was no trauma, but his heart rate was dropping. The employee wanted to give a hint at the fact that the problem was inside him, but it was too late. The problem showed itself. Something nasty came out of his mouth, like a flower, only infernal, vile and creepy, ripping from the gut of human organs. And with each passing second this monster grew larger and larger, and this was being watched now by Seo Jinsu and Artemis, projecting the events into reality. And it turns out that it was these creatures that had carried the infection into the mechanism. The brunette examined the robot's severed head more closely and revealed his facts, such as the fact that, first of all, the body of the infected had already died. In his opinion, although he had never seen anything like it, Drone asserted without any hesitation that it was a 100% mutation, like the mother of the Minogue they'd met in the hallway. And the manager didn't understand what was meant or who Minogue was. The girl repeated again about the woman, whom she called the mother of the terrible creature, Minogue, that had climbed out of her. Hence such was her title. Seo Jinsu was silent at first, not realizing what that just was, and commented on it as a very gut feeling. And Artemis showed her ego and overly high self-esteem by saying she couldn't be wrong because she's exceptional. In the express train, the tablet showed that the destination station was the worker's office, and the robot continued its speech about the fact that in any case, given the machines they had already encountered, it was possible to fall into a stupor if they suddenly encountered completely different M. The brunette leaned a hand to his chin, thinking about the fact that those guys were cars that had already been dated, not new ones. Trying to get to his girlfriend's gut with such a question. Seo Jinsu and Artemis looked up, remembering the starry sky, and thought about the whole situation that had just happened and the one from a year ago. As the girl thought, it was too confusing a topic to deal with right now, so for now it was worth putting it off until the asylum stabilized and focusing on more important things first. Disregarding even half-assed evolution and infection, Seo Jinsu almost died at their hands. And the guy remembered all those scary moments where his heart sank with excitement for his life. The manager tried to scratch his neck, which was incredibly itchy, while concurrently pondering why his death now sounded like some kind of evolutionary success. Artemis, on the other hand, replied that the judgment wasn't so wrong from the infected's point of view. The express arrived, the wheels slowed down, making a creaking sound from rubbing against the rails, and the carriage doors opened. The speaker thanked the passengers for using their train. Seo Jinsu secured the axe behind his back and headed onward with his companion. They were walking down streets that looked more like corridors, because nature, or at least the open sky, didn't exist here, and the brunette was twirling something in his hands. The robot noticed this and realized they were like bullets and was absolutely right. There were 5 of them in the palm of her hand. In order for Seo Jinsu to replace the used ones at the same second, a separate store had to be prepared, which of course he did. And then he realized why his neck had been so itchy all this time. All because of that metal plate. He was getting so used to it by now that he almost forgot. Good thing he had just fumbled for it and had time to take it off. Artemis was surprised that the shield had already broken, but it was for the best. It served as an excellent defense and very timely. If it wasn't for her, this was probably what Seo Jinsu's neck would look like instead of the plate, so it wasn't that he was too upset. With a snide smile, Artemis quit about borrowing a couple brats from her today, and thanked her for it, to which he heard only silence. The girl just flew off, saying their target would be arriving soon, so it was worth getting ready. Navigating the fire sensors, there seemed to be no infected at the destination station. It was unknown which other enemies they might encounter, so even going up the escalator without making a single sound, they still looked around for caution. And then Seo Jinsu saw a rather interesting detail up ahead that couldn't help but stress him out. It was a severed mechanical arm, with dangling wires in the elbow area. It was quite a surprise. Immediately the pair ran over to this evidence and picked it up for inspection. It was a spare part without a weapon. I wondered whose it was. Did that guard now have his brothers, who would provide the same hassle? The girl assumed that a very great force had been used, since she had flown away from the blow, and the manager still did not believe that such a thing was possible. And then, as if a very loud scream sounded overhead, It was so sudden and sharp that a part of the robot that had been found not so long ago fell out of his hands. And Artemis reminded her traveling companion of that one about the voice recording log of the unit for worker supervisor, but it was hard to remember anything now. But she still went on to say that the voice pattern was the same as the last roar in the recording, an object with a huge lung volume approaching. That frightening sound sounded once more. Consternation came to the artificial intelligence now. It was ordering Sojinsu to turn around and return to the rear. And this time the lad obeyed her and hurried to take cover, accompanied by the words of using the inner passage as a row. The robot behind was talking to someone about his interlocutor's behavior being considered a threat to society, which was the reason for the arrest. But that wasn't what the pair of scouts were there for at all. A huge fist with great speed headed straight for the tin can upgraded into something human-like. Of course, such a rumble couldn't make Sojinsu and Artemis not turn around to see what was going on. And unfortunately, their worst assumptions came true. Huge feet with long yellow nasty nails also showed, and his hands rammed more and more on the floor, hitting the guard, turning him into a flapjack. The creepy, horrible monster, with huge muscles, sharp teeth, glowing eyes and clearly a very fiery temper screamed at full force, letting out as much air as it could from its lungs. The atmosphere was filled with tension and a sense of someone else's rage. Artemis froze in midair as she heard the voice of a robot that was living out its last moments and stutter, saying that a rebel threat had been detected in the vicinity. The guard warned the residents to begin evacuating, the light in his eyes slowly fading and his voice muffled. Suddenly the brunette stopped, abruptly, clenched his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut in fear, all the worst thoughts that could. Drops of sweat dripping down his face. They stood there without moving, trying not to even breathe. Once again they were in a mess that threatened their lives, and it could have been fixed if they hadn't been in some pointless musings for so long. The mutant turned and looked at them. Only now did it dawn on Sojinsu that he needed to freeze, even though he had done so a few seconds ago. And while the monster was again beating the robot, which was already not giving any signs of life, despite the two strangers, the manager and his robot slowly began to move on, as long as not to make noise, although I wanted to just run, to get away from the nightmare in reality. The infected took the guard in his hands, as if a little girl, a doll, a very cruel girl, for it was a monster, took a firm grip exactly on the head to tear it off, not letting the victim and say normally the last phrase. The crunch of iron sounded beneath his fingers. The mutant ripped the robot like a rag, wires showing out. And once he'd done everything he was determined to do, tossed the dead and unmolested body part away. And as luck would have it, his head flew right back at Sojinsu, bouncing sharply off the hard and cold floor. It was very disturbing because the robot kept saying something and right under the feet of someone who wanted to be silent and invisible right now. The brunette remembered that in movies usually if you run first you die, but they were not in a movie now and what to do in such a situation was not clear. And it seems the infected weren't going to play by the script of Hollywood movies either. Choking on saliva and growling loudly, he lunged towards those who wanted to escape them. Artemis was the first to realize what was in store for them, and therefore began to yell at Sojinsu, saying why was he still standing there if the situation was so heated. The monster slammed his fist against the wall and was ready to tear into small pieces and just as easily detach his head from the brunette's body. But he wanted to realize his plan and at least survive, so he ran away. His mind replayed the moment as he stood there like a statue with his weapon at the ready and his eyes bulging with fear. And the monster was breathing heavily and about to let out the loudest scream he could create. Sojinsu slowly turned towards the mutant to see if his theory worked with being a statue would succeed, and he wouldn't be noticed. Or still not enough. His eyes looked the other way, a cold and stern look, as if he wasn't the one now in the monster's crosshairs, and prodded Artemis for his decision, asking about whether he was going to give up so easily. So since the brunette couldn't think of what to do on her own, she would give her own clue. For example, her idea was to drop the mutant in the alley. There was no time to think of another plan, simply because the bloody assassin with sharp fangs and incredible muscles was already running towards them with a scream. While he was smashing everything behind him and creating a huge rumble, the couple wandering through the labyrinths of these underground city floors were already running, unable to feel their feet or the ground beneath them. The mutant kept up, accelerating, gaining speed, causing an earthquake from its weight. Compared to him, Sojinsu was just a small ant, and Artemis was dust. It wouldn't cost him anything to crush these bugs without even hearing the crunch of bones. The brunette turned his head to monitor the situation behind him, and it was not happy at all, though they were running away, and someone was flying away. With all their might, the distance between them was not increasing, but quite the opposite, shrinking. Just a little more and the huge monster would catch up to the couple. His fists were crashing down on the floor with renewed force, creating holes and cracks in the floor. It only made them more terrified. Their legs were numb from such an environment, but they had to be tense and under control. He was somewhere about 3 steps away, only 3 steps. It's absolutely nothing. And with everything at stake is a life, the most precious thing a person has. And the realization that he had just run where the bloody fist of a monster was now, a bloodthirsty monster that only craved more deaths of others on its own account. Artemis warned her partner that right now the infected was swinging sharp claws, aiming straight for them. The girl advised to duck as quickly as possible, which Seo Jinsu did instantly, clenching his teeth, hoping it would work and he wouldn't be left without a head, at least not right now. And blessedly, the monster's hand passed over the running brunette without hitting the manager. It didn't leave a single scratch. It was hard to stay on his feet. His speed worsened by the awkward position, almost crouching, and the fact that the monster couldn't get the coveted catch pissed him off big time, which could be recognized by his growls and the steam at his mouth. The pair of so-called travelers bought a little time, as the monster screamed at the top of its voice, opening its arms to gather more strength and try again to grab its victim. He turned to Artemis with a certain pretension in his voice, and such a thing in such a tense moment could be forgiven. Right now there was absolutely nothing working in his soul besides stress and fear. The guy carried on down the street and reminded her that an alley was an alley, but at this rate Seo Jinsu would soon die and not notice it. Didn't she find any building somewhere nearby that had been stripped of insulation? The robot reminded that with that much destruction power, running inside right in front of the enemy's eyes was completely useless. Such an idea would only endanger them more and increase the chance of death. Artemis made a brilliant, parenthetical point, because it was perfectly understandable that they needed to get rid of him somehow before he did a similar thing to them. The girl corrected their movement in time and told them to turn left. She was doing a great job with the navigator's task. Every time they were hit by debris from the back, rocks, or road, the artificial intelligence would clearly calculate it and order them to shorten their legs. And Seo Jinsu, due to his good physical fitness, would manage to do somersaults and crawl on his knees under such flying objects and could go. The brunette clenched his teeth in anger, thinking of the freak who couldn't keep up with them. The infected had been waiting for the guy to back off for some time now, and was getting more and more frustrated, which only caused more aggression, which didn't play well with his victims. The sign that indicated that there were streetcar tracks and a train running nearby was completely crumpled and bent. Even the numerical letters were scattered on the screen. As it turns out, it wasn't all for nothing, and the debris that flew at him served not only as a way to nail him, but also as a reason for the blocked road and escape routes. And as soon as the monster noticed that all the passageways were blocked, a nasty evil grin played on its muzzle. Steam kept escaping from its mouth as if to emphasize its hot anger. Dust traveled through the neighborhood, the ground shook again and the floor began to crack, hinting at another wave of anger. Seo Jinsu realized this immediately. The infected was once again moving to fight and attack, and now needing a little more time to figure out what to do and where to go. And then his companion was able to help him. She was already standing inside some corridor and attracted the brunette's attention, shouting for him to run to her, not to delay. The manager barely made it there in time. The ugly creature of hell had just punched his fist at the spot where Seo Jinsu was just standing, and he was already running on a completely different trajectory, and his main task was not to think about useless things. All you have to do now for minimal survival is just get out of sight of the infected asshole with the glaring eyes and dangerous teeth. The brunette holstered his weapon, realizing that shotgun blasts wouldn't work on those small and hard-skinned eyes, so it was completely useless. They moved forward while the monster was dealing with the wall, but it would definitely not take him very long, so there was no need to relax. And not that it took him very little time at all, it took him absolutely no minute and didn't require a huge amount of strength. He was almost immediately already standing in the same room as Seo Jinsu and Artemis, scattering the remnants of the wall around. And such power was straining the guy infected, as if he was playing with his prey before the pleasure of the kill, and gave some sort of head start by standing and idling in a hole in the wall. The calm before the storm was very short-lived. because the hurricane in the form of a huge mutant was already rushing through the corridors, almost keeping up with the former military man. Seo Jinsu still, despite having come to conclusions about the stupid questions, continued to ask them, such as how a normal person could turn into something like this. Suddenly the brunette braked sharply, putting his foot forward and covering his face with the machine gun just in case, only he wasn't going to give up just yet. As the infected tried to swing again, the guy was already preparing his body to accelerate and make a very massive jump, only his plans were shattered against the huge hands and fingers of his opponent. The monster's hand closed right on Seo Jinsu's legs like a trap. At this moment, his heart went to his heels and fear crept right up to his heart. Artemis was very frightened for her good acquaintance and loyal traveling companion. She didn't know how to help the brunette, or rather, she hadn't figured it out yet. The manager of the asylum found himself upside down in the air. He flailed his legs and tried to break free from such shackles, and before his eyes there was only an open mouth with teeth and menacing eyes of the enemy. It seemed to be a failure, an absolute loss, and life would end at this very moment. The infected maliciously rejoiced at this turn of events. He could already taste that taste of blood and the pleasure of another kill. Seo Jinsu, who was already in an incredible stupor, finally realized that they were not just trying to kill him at once, but also laughing at him, while playing with the victim. As soon as the infected opened its jaws and reached for its prey, the guy immediately pointed his machine gun at it, almost by reflex, and especially now, he had no other option. From the muzzle, as if a light could be seen, the manager pulled the trigger, almost without thinking. Except the cannon wasn't loaded with bullets. He had decided that before now, it just wouldn't help. It would only anger the enemy more and waste ammo supplies. The net released from the muzzle covered the monster's muzzle, completely creating immense discomfort and causing the infected to shake its head. Immediately, Seo Jinsu didn't wait for what would happen next. He pulled out his axe and struck straight at his enemy's fingers, releasing scarlet blood outward and hoping that he would free himself just like that. Except that the automatic weapon fell out of his hands. And the plan worked. The monster let go of the poor guy and immediately began to free his face from the unpleasant mask, and the brunette rushed to the gun, his faithful friend in the battle. He did not know what he would do next, but it was necessary to think of something urgently. Artemis helped with that, flying closer and notifying her that there was an infected free structure nearby, 12 meters ahead, to the right to be exact. It might not work, but it was worth a shot to get away from that monster that was now trying to free its gaze on everything around it. Seo Jinsu tried to look around while escaping, while his enemy was still squirming and screaming in anger. Finally, the infected was able to remove the netting from his muzzle and was now advancing on another search for the same victim. His desire to finish the unfinished business now incredibly heightened. The brunette and his conductor stood in the building, hidden away from the windows. The bulky man walked past, shaking the ground beneath his feet. Seo Jinsu reflected on the fact that security robot in the streetcar was still a flower. Just now he thought he was really going to die. The guy looked out a little from around the corner. Now he was recognizing that this was the real monster. He was trying to monitor the situation outside, but very quickly took his head out of sight, all but again not to get into such an extreme situation. The tension is different from those that look like ordinary people. And the little robot supported the conversation by saying that it is not unreasonable to feel fear when you see in front of you. She showed her projection, and though she didn't look in Seo Jinsu's direction, her words that it was incredibly heroic that the guy didn't panic, made the best decision he could, and moved forward. The brunette was simply speechless. He had very rarely heard such a thing from a girl, seemingly never even. The manager didn't know how to react to it. But Seo Jinsu even so awkwardly didn't accept this praise and huffed. There was no way he had counted on that monster catching him. He didn't understand what kind of infected person still had brains, thus moving away from the awkward moment. The guy might have gotten cocky because of the fact that he'd been to the front, but it wasn't really a stressful situation. He'd been in worse circumstances. The huge beast fell to its knees, listening to what was going on around it, and for a while the surroundings became incredibly quiet. And after recent events, this was only more alarming. Then Seo Jinsu asked about the name of the station they got off at, and if he remembered correctly, it was the workers' office, and Artemis confirmed that information. The brunette, as soon as he heard about it, immediately rushed forward and said that the first thing they should do was to go there. Once they got outside, Hiding behind the wall and trying not to make any signs of presence, the guy explained the fact that he would need to reload his weapon in the staff locker room. Only problem was that there might still be security robots walking around in there somewhere. The girl next to her reminded them that a remote order could be sent from the control room, and that was a real lifesaver for them. The office was closed, but the artificial intelligence would take a detour to avoid running into the infected as much as possible. A blue arrow appeared on the PDA leading to the target, highlighted in green. The guy didn't hesitate long and rushed straight to the point. He sat in ambush and watched from behind the barrel to see what was going on. There was an infected, very thin, and after the one he had just encountered, this one seemed like a fairy tale. He was thinking of a plan. If he crossed this passageway, the main gate of the office would be right there. All that was left was to quietly deal with the little vermin. Only problem was, the freak didn't turn his back, and what the guy wanted so badly now was for the monster to look the other way for at least a second. And as a distraction, the drone worked perfectly. And this provocation worked. The infected looked at the mechanical device, and Artemis was only glad she could be good bait. The girl only added fuel to the fire, calling the mutant in front of her a failure of this barbaric evolution, picking up the most boorish voice. The infected was distracted, which gave the perfect opportunity for Seo Jinsu to grab his cold weapon, the pipe he had found slung behind his back, and head towards his opponent. The monster didn't even look in the direction of whoever was attacking it. It only pointed its hand towards Artemis while not actively attacking. And that was his mistake. The pipe plunged straight into the mutant's head, shattering the jaw to pieces. Surprisingly, the cold iron entered the flesh very well. The brunette jumped back, withdrawing his weapon behind his back, watching as his opponent's skull turned into a bloody mess. The last growls and screams sounded in the alley that spoke of the fact that the eyes of the once human were about to close forever. The iron pipe fell with a clatter to the floor and rolled to the side, finally able to be thrown from his hands. Seo Jinsu promised himself not to use such weapons anymore because the effect was less than it seemed, and headed further on his way. Artemis flew beside him and said that there was nothing to be done. They should just avoid using firearms on the street for a while. Unless, of course, they don't want that giant chasing them again. The same creepy monster started to pop up in his head, and his body was covered in goose flesh. And the guy was looking for ways to use the cannon, assuming that inside the buildings meant it could be used. And the artificial intelligence was absolutely sure that in the soundproofing installations in the asylum buildings, and therefore what the brunette said was true. Seo Jinsu immediately tensed and blurred as he raised his head and saw the inscription above the entrance. It said it was an employee office, but it didn't look like a good building. Huge bricks and almost no windows. It looked incredibly gloomy. And no matter how much the guy did not look at this construction, and the design seemed to him in general out of place, except that Artemis was not distracted by such an aesthetic problem, acted strictly according to the plan that she had, and fulfilled her role, found out that about a few walkers is. And just as the girl asked about whether the brunette could handle those guys, the ground shook once more. There was a great shout from the very giant. With a smile on his face, Seo Jinsu replied that whatever was inside, anything was better than the guide they had recently faced head-on. The manager took the machine gun tighter, pointed it forward, took aim and started to storm the office, took a deep breath and rushed forward. In the lower sector, the employee's office right now, there was a building takeover by one guy who took over. A sign above the door glowed that it was an employee locker room and entry was forbidden to all but those involved. The infected was chained to the wall with the same web that had managed to confuse the huge monster that had tried to kill Seo Jinsu. This time he came to the method with the same, storing ammunition for last resort. Having almost captured his opponent, the guy and the robot were moving forward. Suddenly he noticed something interesting and assumed that there were fire extinguishing equipment in front of him. He picked up one thing, trying to figure out what it was. It was something more like a toy of some sort. It was hard to believe it could somehow help in combat. The brunette waved the thing around a bit, trying to get used to it and see if it would come in handy. Concluded that the center of gravity was good enough. Nothing much to find here, of course, but at least it was a good thing they weren't going empty-handed, considering the axe had been left at the site of the last serious fight. Artemis flew to Seo Jinsu's ear and asked him to stop pretending like he was being forced to take this particular thing. When a guy likes something, the head pattern is different altogether. This made the interlocutor tense up a bit. A fellow traveler to deceive him wouldn't work, so he immediately changed the topic of conversation, reminding him that this was not the time to discuss his hola. and asked about the material of the axe in his hands, hoping the robot could do the analysis. A silly question to the one who all along had been incredibly helpful and gave incredibly valuable information. Artemis immediately determined that the cold weapon was made of a strong titanium alloy and would be good to use, but did not linger long on this and hurried her partner. She reminded Sojin that the control room was on the second floor, and as she passed behind her assistant, the manager looked at the adversary stuck to the wall. This once man was in his work uniform, missing half his head and face, covered in bruises and shrouded in cobwebs, and Seo Jinsu only now noticed something strange with the walking to. Artemis explained that they used rubber bullets specialized for the main weapon, and the most important thing to the guy was that it worked properly. They passed by the bloody walls. The liquid was already dried up. It was like there was a brutal massacre going on here with lots of casualties and brutality. The manager couldn't normally be here, walking down the hallway and seeing all of this, at least not without picking up on the fact that there was a particularly large amount of scarlet liquid. The robot explained that these were murder marks at the hands of the infected, the murder of the people who had trusted the main shotgun and evacuated here. She seemed to know absolutely everything. They walked further along the corridor and here they noticed a very useful resource. In front of them lay rubber bullets, and in sufficient quantity. After a while they walked further, and then they heard a very familiar sound, a growl, which is inherent exclusively to the infected. Standing behind the wall, the brunette looked out from behind the corner and scouted the situation. There were 3 monsters who were just finishing their prey. Nibble, fingers and limbs were red in color, and it was most definitely not paint, especially seeing the sharp teeth sinking into flesh and meat. It was now clear to Sojin's why there was a lot of blood and no corpses at all, and the whole answer was in front of his eyes. The whole problem is that these 3 are normally so chewed up, dried up and decomposing bodies. On the floor lay the body, or rather what was left of it, of a strange man. The lips were as if cut off, the insides gutted. He had been dead for far more than 1 day. Artemis was worried about her partner and therefore wondered if the guy would be able to handle these monsters or if he should look for some other way out of the situation. The drone suggested that they should either go through them without causing any noise or turn around and go to the lower bay. Well, the manager sat behind the wall and pondered his answer, and the girl said completely contradictory phrases, like that he should think it over carefully and at the same time do it as soon as possible. Of course, in this situation it was the most adequate decision, but not easy at all. Seo Jinsu took another look at his opponents, and it seemed to be the right decision for him in his mind already. It was hard to continue to watch these infected finish off the human and would continue to strut around this world. So the guy attacked from behind one of them, driving his new axe right into the top of his head, chopping it into 2 halves. He was serious and anger raged in his blood. The manager wasn't going to wait for any reaction from the others, and so he headed for the next contender for the hole in his head as quickly as possible, already trailing his hand with the cold weapon farther behind his back. The mutants didn't have time to react, as one turned around and immediately saw a blade flash before his eyes, and then darkness and horrible pain. The third had already realized that they were being ambushed, but he took too long to take any action, either because of the surprise of the attack or his own stupidity, because Seo Jinsu was already advancing towards him and was getting closer with every step. It took one clear, sharp, sure move, fast and swift, and the guy has absolutely every ability to pull it off. While the hero was swinging, the monster decided to try and defend himself in some way. He wove his tentacles on his head into one thing that looked something like a horn, except that his opponent's attack was far weaker and far more indistinct than Seo Jinsu's, his arm already descending like a heavy weight, like the punishment of heaven on the infected. All the infected could do was let out a questioning growl, and that was his last sound. The brunette, clenching his teeth in an effort to do as much damage as possible, preferably lethal, lowered his blade, and so he was already calmly walking forward, while behind him lay another mutant corpse, without a head and with internal organs outward, in a pool of blood. Not even having to break through quietly, the fight was too fast, even seemed boring to its winner. Suddenly, Seo Jinsu noticed a small movement from the side, which he was very startled by, because he thought that he had already done away with the bloodthirsty monsters. Still, one freak was moving and making some kind of sound, as if asking for help, though really just slumped over in what was still a world away. It was amazing how this infected survived. With a knife sticking out of his head, the monster continued to growl and scream, choking on saliva. But this serenade did not last long. His head was already split in two and the knife was removed from his forehead. The blood gushed even more from such a wound. Seo Jinsu was walking up the stairs and asked Artemis. She thought he was acting too fast. Ever since he entered the building he felt a strange feeling, and the girl didn't care about the reasons. The important thing was that the enemies were defeated. She tried to explain it all way by saying that because of the rubber bullets hitting her muscles and joints here and there, her physical ability level had dropped a lot. The guy was not particularly pleased with this answer, so with a sarcastic face he thanked the girl for the specific briefing. With each step they climbed higher, were closer to their goal. The drone trying to stay ahead to scout the situation first and develop a plan of action and route. The companions hid behind the wall. The control room door was very close, but there were infected in the way as well. As it turned out, there was only one of the enemies, and that was in the restroom, an enclosed space, a separate room from where no unnecessary sounds would be too audible. When Seo Jinsu walked inside, he could only see the rotten ass of a once human and hear loud growls and discontent. It looked very stupid, downright stupid. Did this worker get stuck in a window trying to escape and get infected? That's the kind of death you don't wish on many people. That the brunette couldn't tear his gaze away from the clearly female body that was flailing its legs, hoping to somehow slip at least some way to the side of the window. She was wearing pantyhose, completely torn and bloody, presumably her once pretty legs. And sure enough, from her feet her eyes slid sharply to the shelf of a racy spot that was completely open to the eye and their enjoyment. Seo Jinsu decided not to show his interest, so he coughed and said that he didn't want to waste his time on it. He said that this infected person didn't pose any danger as it was, which was a rather strange reaction to a very easy prey that had trapped itself. And even now, seeing everything with her all-seeing eye, her lens, Artemis noticed something she couldn't believe. She put a hand to her chin and began to ponder the fact that the guy's hormone levels and blood flow had increased too much. And while Artemis was analyzing exactly which places had the most tension, which was the heart and groin, Seo Jinsu tried to divert her attention by yelling about how she just got it all wrong and asked about whether she was afraid of him being distracted by a monster. The guy was looking for new excuses, saying that he was on death's doorstep. That's why his body was making such strange reactions. But the artificial intelligence interrupted him, saying she wasn't going to criticize him either. All because the only one who gets ahead through the pain and danger is Seo Jinsu. The guy picked a lock on a door that would have been difficult to open at all without initial training and programming knowledge. The door opened to Artemis' indulgence that the irrational behavior of a human being who faces his limits is somewhat understandable. But here a far from the most pleasant picture awaited them. On the floor sat a maiden, and in front of her a huge fat man, absolutely naked. On his body were old rivulets of blood. While Seo Jinsu was just dying from the smell around him, Artemis felt the human emotion of taking away the gift of speech, and then expounded that the earlier comment was solely about the guy next to her. The brunette couldn't understand how it was possible to think of bringing a first-generation sex robot into the office. The girl looked very realistic. One would think she was real, but the details on her body gave away her cold mechanical nature. The joints that became better visible on the arms and legs when viewed from the front reminded us that the creature was not human even more. The manager came over to inspect everything and realizing that the robot had an oral function, concluded that this was the latest version. Artemis didn't understand how Seo Jinsu could know that, but then she thought it was none of her business, and she didn't want to hear something nasty. But there was a chance she'd get that answer. The guy walked around the chair where all the action of lust was taking place, never ending again, and concluded that after isolation in such a small room, barely holding on, this man never got an answer. So he wanted to end his life, rejoicing at the last. Artemis yelled at the guy, asking him to s. It was only now that Seo Jinsu realized that he was behaving in the wrong way. He felt like he was really going crazy. And the girl next to him reminded him that this was not the time for self-criticism, and he should just quickly check the security robots and leave. Only the brunette reached for the lever to turn on a huge screen, as something somewhere shorted out. There was no interference on the screen now. There was absolutely nothing on it. It felt like my heart had gone into heels at the most crucial moment such an adventure happened. Artemis looked at the guy, and Seo Jinsu, not taking his eyes off the huge monitor, explained that he had nothing to do with it. He had no time to do anything. And then, quite suddenly, a line appeared in the air, which tracked the sound vibrations and their volume. The voice spoke with huge interruptions and interference. It was possible to make out only that something with the security robots is wrong, and then particles of words, which did not allow to, and then the phrase that he would be able to help. The girl and guy froze for a while, digesting everything. Seo Jinsu was shocked. Is there really a survivor and this man is still not dead? Wondering where he is and who he is. And as if on cue, the voice decided to introduce itself because it procrastinated too long and ended up being late in greeting me. An image of a girl appeared in front of his eyes. Delicate lips parted, uttering the words, "She is an artificial intelligence to manage the safety of the asylum, and her name is Rose." She was a brunette with big beautiful eyes. Her hair was tied up in a high ponytail and she was wearing a strict suit. She told him that in order to resolve the situation, the guy and the robot would need help. In the year 1991, an ecological experiment was conducted in the United States of America, which was very important for mankind. It took place in a large enclosed space, such an ambitious project to create an artificial ecological system. Who would have thought that one minor mistake would lead to such huge consequences? The fact that cement can absorb a small amount of carbon dioxide was overlooked, and because of one small mistake, as soon as it was launched, a chain reaction started the destruction of the entire internal ecosystem. The first to give up were the fish, which simply died out. Therefore, when it comes to the operation of closed cities, not a single small flaw, not even the slightest human error can be tolerated. Seo Jinsu was also involved then, drinking his hot coffee and looking at the documents he was given in his hands. Of course, in such a situation, the introduction of high-performance artificial intelligence for management purposes was an unmistakable necessity. The city's private disaster prevention operations center just sent the letter of acceptance for a system administrator. Her code name was Ro, and her task was to work as a security guard. She needed to be sent to the central control shelter and incentivized, and the brunette was about to complete the whole process already. But then an error popped up that the state was inoperable. The girl on the screen once again repeated the phrase about being late in greeting. Now the same girl with the documents, an artificial intelligence to manage local security, at the private town's Aegis Disaster Prevention Center. Rose. Seo Jinsu's mind was spinning with thoughts and puzzles formed into one picture. If it was the one on security management, then it was one of the three artificial intelligences involved in the early days before he even came. He said that he had only seen the records of the acceptance letter. So Rose expressed without emotion, though her face looked worried, that the original resting state should have been lifted only after all settlement instructions had been followed. But she was triggered by the triggering of the emergency isolation protocols. She covered her eyes as if sighing heavily. Even though it was an abnormal situation, she was still happy to meet the system administrator. Seo Jinsu decided to play on his traveling companion's jealousy and picked up on the fact that this girl on screen was constantly using a respectful form of speech, which wasn't much like Artemis, who was constantly boasting about herself and criticizing the guy. And then with a look of arrogance he added that here was the proper behavior of an artificial intelligence towards a human. And now Rose recognized the one who had come along with the brunette here. It was a great honor for the brunette to meet Artemis, and the brunette didn't know how to react to this situation, so she couldn't make anything but awkward noises. Rose began to praise her coworker because she had used her own skills to complete a project that was already near collapse, and then thanked her. She folded her fingers next to each other and placed her palm against her chest right where her heart was. The girl bowed, saluting Artemis, calling her the best masterpiece of this generation. The robot over the screen was a bit shocked at this turn. Finally, she too could rebuke Seo Jinsu, launched her hologram, her hair flying up in the air, and asked if her partner had heard. Now she too could gloat, saying that this was how one should behave towards a girl who did everything possible for him, and, it seemed, sometimes even more. The blonde pointed a finger in the brunette's direction, a cold gaze reaching into his very soul and quoting himself. As he said that to her, who usually had to put up with Seo Jinsu's disrespect, then the guy should have had words of appreciation. And the manager was now getting pissed off because his ego had been tried to be lowered again. He recognized that Rose's words were so true, but he couldn't say them, probably because of his pride, and began to remember the past. The asylum worker was scrolling through that moment, once Artemis was brought in, delivered to the asylum man while the workers were installing all the parts. The guy was studying the paperwork, and he was just shocked that all those tasks of simulating the central control of the asylum that the artificial intelligences of the previous 3 generations couldn't pass had changed dramatically. The girl solved them without even connecting directly to the asylum. The screen popped up saying that everything had gone just perfectly, except that despite that label, at the time, even it wasn't perfect in everything, so it shouldn't have been overpraised. Meeting for the first time with other artificial intelligence, involuntarily recalls the first time he saw Artemis, and the girl asked to hold the horses. Why would such an honor suddenly? She then hoped that the brunette will not tell about it. But Jinsu wasn't listening to the blonde. He was immersed in his own thoughts that were completely absorbed by the interlocutor beside him. He was very curious as to why she was named after the moon goddess, and she was already starting to get angry, being ignored. Just because the person who gave her the name loves mythology. So that's weird. No, something's wrong. She was originally part of a project to colonize the moon. At the same time, to expand the regions of habitation for people, the production of mineral resources on the moon. For tens of thousands of people, it would be a springboard for the development of deep space, the first city outside the Earth. Starting with the design of the lunar colonies, and after all the work is done, prioritized by a supercomputer designed for central control tasks. A supercomputer that deserves to be named after the moon goddess, the best of all intelligences. However, the project was cancelled and was never revisited again. With the world situation so volatile in the midst of a burgeoning war, the project was shut down. It was so praised and hoped for. All the scientists gathered around the device and scrutinized it, understanding its settings and abilities. In no time became a labor-intensive mess that only hit the budget. Eventually the place she was sent to after being purchased at auction became just that, a shelter. It was huge, multi-story, enormous and yet unfinished. And Seo Jinsu replied that to be honest, his first impression of her wasn't so much as a goddess. He watched her facial features and unhappy emotions, the lowered corners of her lips and furrowed brows. She was more in tune with the image, the depressed princess trying to shut herself off from everything around her. And that Artemis could not be recognized right now, in a slightly insolent, strict and demanding girl, who with her hands at her sides demanded Seo Jinsu to answer about what he was doing now. It was important for him to get into every detail of the conversation and surroundings now. The brunette hadn't thought then, when they first met, that there would come a time when artificial intelligence would start behaving the way it did now, and he didn't even know which was better. Rose was uncomfortable with the conversation, so she was very sorry for interrupting the discussion, but she just needed to remind her visitors that they didn't have time for all this arguing. Those who had just been arguing flinched when they realized it. The girl on the screen said that the power supply in the shelter was not working, although Seo Jinsu already knew that, which was the reason why they had actually come here from the main office. Artemis wondered with a cold tone about the guard robots, how things were going with that class. She needed to know a clear number of working units. Rose began to analyze the information, using resources that were mission appropriate. Only the result was not particularly pleasing. There were now 0 of them left, and the last unit was killed exactly 39 minutes ago. Brutally murdered in the square next to the employee's office. It was now clear that this was the brainless one. Artemis asked not to be so hasty with the flow of information. She assumed that the ability of the security robots to eliminate the infected was severely limited. She needed to know if her colleague thought so as well. Rose said the infected started showing up as soon as the emergency lockdown went into effect, and the workers' supervisor put security robots from all over the lower sector of the city around that building. But the giant individuals that followed later destroying most of them at once, and the remaining robots were destroyed over the course of many months. Now Seo Jinsu didn't understand why that man was here while people were going out and dying, should have engaged the military armament of the lower sector. Clearly only took care of himself. Because Rose didn't have the couples to issue orders, she was left to observe. Artemis couldn't blame the artificial intelligence for that. Her main unit is the lower sector control room, if the girl remembered correctly. The blonde agreed that since they were heading there first thing too, so if they needed Rose's help, they'd be in touch right away. And Seo Jinsu found a whole cartridge on the floor. The girl on the screen disconnected and waited for another call. The door to the supervisor's office closed. The pair walked quietly through the corridors and thought about what to do next. Seo Jinsu held the bloody axe tightly in his hand. there's no gravity on the way to the destination that another super mutant won't crawl out. According to Rose, there are more than one or two of these, and Artemis had a good idea. Here they were already standing at the entrance to the sewer. It was hard to get down because of the smell, but there wasn't much to do. The traveling companion ordered her not to relax. There would be no giant mutant here, but there were no fire sensors here either. Now, however, they will make their way, relying only on their own feelings. They progressed through the vast corridors of the sewers, dampness, foul odor and darkness all around, with pipes stretching under the ceiling. Seo Jinsu was walking on a rocky pala right next to muddy water with something swimming through it, and Artemis was very thankful for the fact that she wasn't a living thing. The girl already imagined that if she had to smell this odor, she could hardly tolerate it. It was just awful here just from the looks of it. But the guy replied that he's not so sure about such claims because the mask's gaseous protection is good and blocks odors. The artificial intelligence didn't quite understand it because the guy had said earlier that he wanted his senses to stay alert. Does the brunette want Artemis to disable the odor blocker again? Which of course the partner was not particularly happy about and explained that it was better to go through. He began to justify that it is still for hygiene, and it also cleans. It would seem that inside such a place not a single person would not think of hiding. And then the guy began to consider everything that was even happening to them right now and drifted off into his own thoughts, leaving only a meaningful mooing. With Jinsu, he couldn't believe what was happening at all and that it was all really real. Finally, their so-called stop in the sewer and the guy could quietly lift the hatch. Well, or not as quietly as it seems. He got a little peek at what was going on in there and immediately saw the paws of the monsters that were everywhere. Blessedly, neither of them paid attention to the fact that the huge iron plate that covers the hole in the floor jingled, nor did they turn around. After assessing the situation and seeing a really large number of infected, which decided for him the fact that it is worth to go to the next hatch and not to risk so much, because Seo Jinsu began to go down the stairs back, and Artemis was more interested in whether it is necessary to constantly ch. And to the excuses that the guy did realize it, the girl replied that since it was clear, he should have moved faster and harder. And the artificial intelligence expressed that although she advised, she was somehow concerned about being in this place, which was completely incomprehensible to the brunette, because the companion does not smell. The voice from the drone explained that although Artemis had no sense of smell, she did have an overview. Seo Jinsu's eyes can't see it, but there are plenty of particles in the air that his partner's non-human body can notice. Glancing at the screen, Artemis compared what she saw to a large snowfall in the coldest winter, and just to their dismay, it wasn't just weather conditions. Sure, each of the snowflakes here is just bacteria colored green and brown, but here was one nuance. And then the manager suggested that we might as well not watch it, if that's the case. And from such foolishness that came out of the guy's mouth, Artemis had only one reaction, which she tried to cover with her hand from the eyes of others, even though there was no one else around. And the guy reasoned about the place they were in. There were no mere humans or infected. The road is straight. That should be enough to recognize the threat and eliminate it. And then Artemis abruptly turned to face the bow, quite suddenly and with an intonation that sent shivers down her spine, said that she was responsible for her words. The girl will use all the right means to track down any dangers that may overtake her friend, all the way to the end of this journey, so to speak. The brunette was for a while in a stupor at such words, realizing that it wasn't just rudeness, but such a way to express her concern. It was hard for her to do it any other way, because the corners of his lips immediately spread into a warm smile. It was his response to everything he had just heard, and the girl was a little pissed off. She didn't understand why Seo Jinsu was smiling like that. It seemed completely inappropriate, and the guy understood that there was no way Artemis would ever be able to find him again. Now her past appearance full of nothing but sadness, performing tasks in silence since being placed in the asylum. Once she recognized her own depression as a bug in the system, and at the same time it was able to correct its own code, which no one has ever seen before. It is too much even for artificial intelligence. A bright light burned in his eyes, blinding him, but it was impossible to look away from what appeared before him. Artemis appeared in her full beauty, the goddess of triumph they had observed, then reborn through immortality of consciousness. An incredibly beautiful girl with long thick blonde hair and light glowing eyes. She held out her hand. Codes filled her entire morgue, programming languages of a structure the guy had never seen in his life. It was fantastic to look for, and all the surprise was written all over the brunette's face. And Seo Jinsu said what he really thought about Artemis, which was that she was an incredibly badass woman who could do incredible things. The girl, however, turned around very quickly and reminded him that she was more pleased with material things than mere words, to which her partner laughed quietly and commented, saying that the girl would soon get them too. Looked at his feet and repeated again that it would not be long before everything would be as she wished. Be that as it may, Seo Jinsu himself hadn't realized how impressed he had remained with Artemis since then, and now he was following the same woman through the dark corridors of the sewers. The fact that the guy had donated absolutely all of the shelter to her was because of that very moment. The brunette, on the other hand, was all in his thoughts as he followed his traveling companion and thought about her and their relationship, and how things hadn't gone according to plan as soon as the infection came out. But he had been in the clouds for too long, so soon enough the flow of thoughts was interrupted by the sudden bump of his head against Artemis, who was flying ahead. Immediately the guy grabbed his head and bent over. The brunette didn't seem to realize what had happened, and then the artificial intelligence turned to him with alarm in its voice. Very suddenly, Artemis ordered Seo Jinsu to run as fast as possible, much to the brunette's surprise. It was only now that Seo Jinsu heard a rumbling and subtle squealing behind him, and not just one creature at that. And it was necessary to get away as quickly as possible, because behind them a pack of rats with glowing eyes was coming like a wave in the sea. Because of this, Seo Jinsu decided to escape immediately and listen to Artemis' explanation about the masses of small-sized creatures approaching quickly, even though it was clear enough. And the guy didn't understand what the artificial intelligence meant by calling it small-sized creatures. They were just ordinary rats, that's what the brunette thought. But the girl asked not to rush to those conclusions. These were not ordinary gray animals. The blonde thought so too at one point. But the whole clue was in the moment when this herd was hunting. Stranger objects had joined them, and right now the robot was trying to scan the crowd of parasites. Among the smaller rodents were 3 huge mutants that looked even more threatening. Seo Jinsu was surprised that it was also infected, but Artemis had little faith in that either. Right now the focus should not be on that, but on getting away. And then the girl remembered the hatchlings. She wondered if there was a place they could safely go up to, for the infected were very numerous at most of the hatchlings. And now, from the data the girl had gotten, it was possible to go up, avoiding them in only one place, nearby hydroponic systems, and so the artificial intelligence hurriedly loaded the location into the points, and the partner needed to quickly switch between tasks, escape and follow a certain path. And that made the asylum manager genuinely surprised at what he saw on his lenses. Pupils narrowed. He was shocked that such an open place had been chosen. Artemis explained that it was not comparable to a giant, and close to an individual emitting large amounts of gas. But there is no time to choose. At the moment of escape it is impossible, or too dangerous and risky to look for other ways. You could cringe at the sight of them, how huge they were. Just incredibly intimidating and looked as dangerous as possible. And as soon as Seo Jinsu was near the ladder, he immediately jumped onto it, grabbing it tightly with his hands. The brunette began to climb to the top, only to have his feet higher from the mutants with only the appearance of rats. They hissed below. They were more than 10 times the size of normal rodents, with horrible sharp teeth, and red glowing eyes that growled as they sat on the floor just under the stairs. The parasite tried to jump up and grab onto the leg of the asylum manager and their victim hanging from above. But the rat couldn't cope with the shoe, so the massive soul slammed right into its face, knocking out a couple of fangs. And after such an invigorating run, Seo Jinsu took another look at the nasty critters, though there weren't many of them, and started to open the hatch to fresh air, away from the rodents. The brunette slammed the trapdoor shut and kicked it down. But they made a lot of noise, so we have to deal with this situation somehow. And now it only made more sense why there was no sign of humans here under those conditions, and Artemis had threatened him, telling him not to relax so much, because there's definitely a supermassive object nearby that she was able to spot. Drone turned to face behind the guy's back, and such a pause made Seo Jinsu, too, pay attention to what was going on behind him. There from the wall, as if it were one solid glass, which was cracked by huge branches as if of a tree, from which green steam burst out. And this of course raised huge questions among the travelers. They didn't realize what it was, the likes of which they had never encountered before. This something was incredibly tree-like, and seemed to stink so badly that the scent could not only be smelled with your nose, but seen. And with every second the smell was getting more and more. If it wasn't for the mask, you could probably suffocate instantly. Artemis noticed that the concentration of air pollutants had increased. She checked the abnormal atmospheric components before they left. The girl suggested that they were probably coming from this particular creature, and Seo Jinsu asked not to be so hasty with the information. He wondered if it would hurt if there was skin contact, and Artemis answered that a gas mask would suffice because she had already collected samples in the sewers and finished analyzing them before the partners went up. There's no substance or bacteria there that directly harms the human body. And the guy was very confused by the very expression directly. Artemis was just trying to recommend not getting particularly close to this substance. A green nasty liquid was already spilling out from below, with bubbles appearing on the surface. The tree was swelling with bubbles on it, from which a horrible slurry was just bursting out. It was disgusting to look at. Seo Jinsu noticed that it was flowing very viscously from top to bottom, and Artemis was creepily disgusted by it. She asked to dispense with such horrible expressions. The fumes were getting more and more. All that was left was to pray that the gas mask didn't fail. But suddenly the bubble began to swell and became a brighter color, as if it was turning into a monster. It got to the point where the bubble almost rose completely, started shaking and separating into little pieces, and was about to burst. Which is actually what happened. Artemis was lighting the whole thing up and the guy was trying to cover himself so his face wouldn't get dirty. He was generally shocked that it was spreading in this way. So the travelers turned around and hurried to look for another row, because this one won't work, so they'll have to make a detour through the ruined greenhouse that is on the left. Seo Jinsu was as skillful as before in smashing the infected's heads with his axe, decisive and swift. Artemis, on the other hand, was moving forward, saying that it was exactly as they thought. Through the explosive action coming from two different emissions, the atmospheric pollutants were spreading. Shaking his weapon from the blood, he compared all the monsters to stink bugs, climbed over the corpse of his opponent, and headed after his traveling companion. Artemis said that in any case, if the contaminants spread as far as the power plant next to the hydroponics units, and now they were near the very station from which the strange slurry was streaming. It was everywhere, coloring everything around in the area green. Goosebumps were going up and down my spine. And then an explosion sounded, illuminating everything with fire. Such a sound was hard not to notice. And if it came to this place, then there was a connection reaction that caused such a flame and explosion. But Jinsu and Artemis were already moving through the corridors. The infected were spreading clumps of this liquid in their hands, and there were a lot of them. This whole situation just confirmed two hypotheses at the same time: the existence of the explosion and the existence of an energy source in these guys. The infected growled and hissed. They had no pupils and their mouths looked intimidating. Their hands with long claws held viscous orbs. They pulled themselves up like ants. It seemed as if something was controlling them, which was hard to believe, but the girl next to her didn't give much thought to that. She reminded them that they didn't have much time. The green slurry ran down the walls. There were huge clumps of slime in it. Atmospheric pollutants approaching the power plant again. But there was no problem with the power plant itself. Artemis was tracking their movement and analyzing everything around them. So, in her own opinion, they are lucky that the station is close to the hydroponics plants. A pink dot displayed the destination, namely the lower sector control room. Thus, the solution becomes much easier, though a huge difficulty was infected around. The mutants lined up one by one in a row with the very same liquid in their hands and growling from their mouths. And Seo Jinsu also noticed that it didn't look easy, but Artemis said that it was paramount to occupy this location and that would be the end of it. Too bad there was no underground path, and the only thing left was the open space right up to that door. The brunette looked at these monsters and saw these ignorant men remain in their seats without a single movement. It wasn't clear if they were also under someone's control. In his mind he was thinking of ways to solve this problem they had gotten themselves into. Artemis said something about how if that was the case, then maybe even passing by them wouldn't move them, and then asked about whether the guy was thinking something similar and so stupid that it made Seo Jinsu a little angry. The manager, instead of answering, simply asked if the partner had a passage plan. Artemis only questioned her partner's trust in her. Therefore she was angry and couldn't bear to be so disappointed. The brunette only looked at her sternly. He didn't like the conversation going in this direction, and, so that no conflict would break out, he smiled warmly and replied that he had absolutely complete trust in Artemis, for they had come an incredibly long way together. And since that's the case, Seojinsu has to follow the robot, so he'll have to move his feet fast and not get caught by the infected. The manager had already begun slaying the enemies, getting close behind the infected and swinging his axe, and putting his cold weapon into his opponent's skull. He suddenly looked forward, and Artemis looked there as well. Ahead was an even larger crowd of monsters to be exterminated. They hissed and growled. The girl asked her partner what was wrong and why he was suddenly frozen in place and inactive. The infected fell to the floor, spilling a puddle of blood from his cracked head, and Seojinsu gathered his strength with renewed vigor. He moved forward, pondering that things were even worse with their land than he had realized before. The brunette sighed heavily and began to say that he had one dream, such as to get rich and buy a house on wheels, which, unfortunately, can no longer be realized. The manager was determined to take his retriever with him and go hiking in the mountains. A picture appeared before my eyes, pleasant and warm, just a fairy tale, a quiet life without such an apocalypse. Artemis didn't know how to help her friend, so she suggested an alternative, if only Seojinsu wanted to. A small forest could be created in the shelter to recreate everything in his head. While the guy wouldn't really want to play into believing that everything around him would be real, even though it wasn't, he couldn't turn down any chance to try and see his dream in reality. In the meantime, Artemis insisted with vigor on ridding the place completely of the parasites that posed a danger by their existence. Seojinsu looked at the huge iron thing set in front of him, and once again questioned the girl next to him about whether this was her plan. The blonde asked if his partner liked this incarnation and way of fighting the infected, and with a menacing smile, as if he were a villain, the brunette replied that he still liked what he was seeing. It was an enormous car, a truck. The manager wanted to get on with the plan as quickly as possible and get behind the wheel of such a beauty. Already after a couple minutes, a completely ridiculous situation happened. The drone was trying to move, but not really succeeding because it was strapped in with a seatbelt, which Seojinsu used wisely, even though it didn't make much sense. Artemis agreed to this only on the condition that it would really calm the guy down, a machine gun laying nearby. That's when the girl asked the guy to take a deep breath and warned him that once he started, he shouldn't pay attention to anything else to perform everything at maximum concentration. And there was no need to worry. Even if the enemies got too close to the brunette, everything would be fine, because artificial intelligence will be able to completely block the road and thus help buy time, and let the guy only think about getting to the control room. Seojinsu's heart was pounding like crazy. The car's headlights flashed on, the engine started, and the truck roared to life. Artemis once again questioned if the brunette was ready to begin their risky subpar mission. The guy gripped the steering wheel. It was hard not to worry about what was going to happen next, but there was nowhere to go, so it was worth it just to put on a wicked grin for his opponents and say that he was absolutely ready. There was more than one car speeding away. There was already blood on the glass. They marched in rows, knocking down the infected, splashing their scarlet iron-flavored fluid, but they didn't flee, only marched forward, forcing their way through. At the very back was just a huge green-colored lorry, several times larger, and Seojinsu had a hint that it would be more reassuring to drive something like that. Artemis found such a thought very smug. It didn't distract the brunette much from the main task at hand. After all, she remembered that her partner had gone into the thick of the infected, and it wasn't long before she was still going there. The guy laughed a little, absolutely completely agreeing with the girl and the fact that these were just two weird thoughts, so the drone asked to just be prepared for anything. The cars were just around the corner, and according to the artificial intelligence, in 11 seconds, it would start pulling into the square of the control tower, where there was a very large number of infected people. And so the monsters finally noticed those who were on their way to finish them off, though it was rather foolish to just now start reacting. And then they rushed straight through, right into such a wall of cars, completely unaware that it was only faster. The infected screamed and roared, put out their fists and prepared to devour the people, whose number was unknown to them. In the furies, Artemis' screen showed triangles that displayed mutants that were moving right at them, and the farther away from them, the more of them there were. As the girl expected, the nearby infected gather in a crowd. There were a lot of them, but the quantity is satisfactory for them to get through those icons on the monitor. Only in life it was more difficult. These mutants were climbing right under the wheels, but fell one by one, dying. But the huge infected stood behind and did not twitch especially, waiting for the small ones to take all the strength from the enemy. Their bodies were turning into wet bloodstains, But then the monsters started catching up to the cars and behind them, trying to keep up with the speed of the vans. Artemis warned that just a little more and they would crash. The headlights of the cars shone with a bright white light, blinding the mutants. It would take a little longer to see if the infected could stand up to the crowd of so many vans. It was only now that they screamed, seemingly finally out of fear, covering their muzzles, but they had no intention of scattering. Now those infected were right on the windshields of the cars, but those cars didn't stop, crushing the scary creatures that tried to fight back. This fight turned into a bloody mess and scarlet liquid stained everything around: the floor, the wheels of the cars, their glass. Some mutants managed to sneak through the trucks, except that they were placed in such a way that if you managed to survive on the first row, the second one would not bypass you and crush you. The monsters were freakishly stupid, and you could tell that very well from their facial expressions, completely inattentive. That not being alert was very dangerous in such a situation, which affected their lives very quickly as Seo Jinsu blew away his enemies and stretched some meters forward on the hood. The brunette chuckled evilly and only pressed harder on the gas, crushing the enemies under the wheels. He did not plan to slow down. The guy was glad that now it was really possible to get through such a crowd, though not really in a fair fight, though what fairness could be talked about at such a moment. Finally the giants also joined the fight, displaying their huge teeth, roared and showed with all their appearance that they were ready to attack. Arethmus, on the other hand, noticed the danger and called Jinsu's attention to what she saw. The danger was above, and it was worth doing something about it as soon as possible. She shouted, ordering a quick dodge, and Seo Jinsu knew it himself and was already twisting the steering wheel to save himself. And the manager did it very timely. Just near their car landed a huge infected, which before that wanted to crush with its weight the iron on the wheels. And as if the mutant would understand him, the guy asked him to be careful, squeezing out all the sarcasm in his voice. The monster slammed his elbow into the trailer of the car trying to do damage. The attack was so strong that the car's window glass shattered, releasing shards outside. Of course Sojin didn't like that, and tried to hold the steering wheel, twisting it to stay on the originally constructed path. And already, the monster had already unclenched its mouth, clenched its fist, and set its sights on harming the opponent sitting in the cockpit while roaring. Though the infected managed to leave a dent in the wagon, but immediately the backlash came to his ugly body. The monster spat out blood. His eyes darkened. This was too sudden for him. As much as the infected man tried to at least grab onto the truck at the last moment, it failed. The small machines, which are designed to lift small loads, finally finished him off. Seo Jinsu dashed forward and looked around to make sure the enemy was saddled off and generally defeated. Artemis ordered her partner not to relax, yet just almost die, which should have been a good lesson in this fight. The number of vehicles previously available to them is reduced due to monsters clinging to them and putting them out of commission. Guy and girl are at a disadvantage regarding consumables. The giants have been smashing cars into the floor in general, and since this is the case, we need to break through to at least one point. The end will justify the means. The standoff between the vans and the infected continued, with Seo Jinsu gripping the steering wheel and not letting go of the gas pedals. The monsters didn't back down, standing strong on their own feet, even though they saw their brethren being blown apart under tires and squashed into sap. The brunette himself was pleased to see the fact that he himself had exterminated an already considerable topo just by sitting in the driver's cab of the car. He praised himself and liked the way things were going for them, though he wasn't a fan of brutality, but exterminating the vermin was his goal. And then there was an entrance that was beginning to open. This was very welcome. One could assume that it was Rose who had worked on making their path so easy. But immediately the Joe was replaced by fear and shock. This was something Seo Jinsu hadn't expected just before the finish line. The incredibly huge infected was pounding his fist on the floor, either showing his anger or crushing his own partners. His eyes glowed with rage and his fangs protruded, releasing as much saliva as possible. His muscles were bloody, but the blood was not his, the others, his victims. But the asylum manager wasn't about to stop either. His foot pressed harder and harder into the gas pedal, accepting this challenge. The brunette only now recognized the scumbag he had failed to defeat last time, but managed to outwit and escape. The machine was getting closer and closer to the infected giant, who was already swinging his arm, calculating the moment to strike the man and turn him into a doormat. But even in Sojin said something to surprise the enemy. The cannon was pointed directly at the mutant King Kong in a man-meets-man tag. The monster brought his fists down sharply on his enemy, growling to increase his fear. And from the muzzle of the cannon came the bullet that would decide everything. Immediately, several shots were fired towards the giant, which only angered it more, but did not do any damage. The infected grabbed the car in front of him and squeezed hard with his long claws in a desire to crush those inside. Seo Jinsu lay unconscious, and Artemis tried to bring his friend to his senses, though not very successful. The guy lay face straight into the airbag, but he didn't let go of the machine gun from his hands. And the girl kept pushing him, saying she knew he had no abnormalities in his vital signs, so he should get up. The manager trembled and started criticizing, saying he didn't have to say it that way, but more interested in how things were going with the monster that attacked him. Everything was smoking under the car. And what was his joy when Seo Jinsu realized that they had gotten rid of that monster that had been messing with their heads for so long after all. And Artemis said not to get too excited ahead of time. And then their car started shaking in place, which created a huge amount of stress. And not only was it frightening, but also the muzzle of the infected, who after all did not die, but was chattering his teeth perfectly whole and healthy. Because Seo Jinsu didn't hesitate, he pointed his machine gun at him and wanted to finish off his opponent as quickly as possible. The infected man flipped the truck on its side, while the manager wished him dead, even though it was already clear that headshots were useless. And his partner was directing him to her, telling him it was better not to waste ammo on something that wouldn't work. Seo Jinsu motioned, panicked, asking if it was even possible to finish this guy off. And the girl asked not to ask too many questions and just keep going. The monster heard something nearby just roaring, and it caught his attention so much that he was distracted from his original goal of killing the man. While the mutant was holding one truck in the rivers, another, green, was coming at him at breakneck speed. This machine has been knocking down every infected in its path, and now intends to harm another, only a few dozen times more. Unfortunately for the monster, and fortunately for those who had a mission in this place, the giant was too late to react and pay attention to the approaching danger. While Seo Jinsu and Artemis were jumping off the truck, another car crashed into the mutant and knocked him off his feet. At least it seemed that way because of the sound that thundered behind them. The green car crashed into the wall, and like a tin can almost folded up in a breath. And what to speak of the infected? The guy lay on the floor and waited for all the action nearby to subside a bit. The monster was one big bloody mess. Seo Jinsu was getting up from his knees, and to begin with he wanted to ask Artemis about what would happen if he was even a second too late to react, but then thought it was better he didn't know. The artificial intelligence only assured that the brunette need not worrying about useless things because her calculations are always perfect, and then ordered her to get inside through the crack as quickly as possible. Seo Jinsu looked at the monster whose case was shuddering in its last death convulsions and was finally relieved that death had befallen this vile creature as well. But I didn't stare for long. Quickly followed my friend and snuck inside the building. They ran down a long hallway. There wasn't much lighting, but Artemis had some help with that. So Bo pondered what would happen next, worried somewhere deep inside about whether there would be any more particularly dangerous monsters. Seo Jinsu was glad that the finish line was just around the corner and this journey would come to its logical conclusion. The artificial intelligence was happy that luck was on their side, and her traveling companion had everything intact and nothing broken. But even here the manager started to interrupt her, saying that just because he didn't seem to have anything broken didn't mean he wasn't dying of severe pain, right? Artemis, of course, was worried if everything was okay with her friend, and the latter awkwardly said that even if it wasn't, it was still worth enduring. After a while and these difficulties would be over. Suddenly, they were contacted by Rose, who asked if the guys had already arrived inside the control tower, and those replied that they were already right in front of it. And Artemis asked the girl to make a detailed report on the infected inside the building. Rose, on the other hand, apologized, but it was not possible to perform a check of the appropriate credentials at this time. The situation was that with the minimum security credentials in place, there was only the ability to open and close doors at this time. Of course, this amount of information was not pleasing, but it was enough for the moment to proceed. And then Seo Jinsu praised Artemis, for without her connection, he couldn't even open the doors. And then Rose questioned the blonde about whether there was a reason she needed such a detailed report. The same didn't answer. The mutant breathing inside was fixed, and it was rather curious. The gas release itself is very unstable, which posed a hazard. Seo Jinsu was running down the hallway. He was used to getting into all sorts of situations like this by now, and asked his traveling companion if there were any ways around it. She said there weren't, and that walker on the computer on his arm was blocking the stairs leading to the control room. The brunette began to whine about having to go to the second floor again. He was already very tired, and there was only one underground road. Artemis said that the administrative buildings should be strengthened first, and that was the manager's viewpoint. Seo Jinsu reloaded the magazine of his assault rifle. Reloading the weapon accepted the fact that such a thing could be endured. Seo Jinsu exhaled heavily, gathering his thoughts and strength. I looked around the corner and saw a real monster, a creepy one with many eyes on its head and veins bulging on its body. The guy didn't expect that this mutant moved so fast and in 1 second it would be right next to him. He wasn't ready. He was only thinking about how to get through, and here it has to be done. This monster hissed, and as if hypnotizing with its eyes whoever looks at it. The manager panicked. He realized how dangerous the creep in front of him was, but he didn't know what to do now. Meanwhile, the infected had already clenched its clawed hands and was ready to attack its victim. In the brunette's head began to happen real chaos. Everything doubled before the eyes. The fear of dying began to beat in the mind and stupefy it. Artemis, on the other hand, forced her traveling companion out of this state and came to her senses with only her loud and menacing voice. And it was necessary to gather as quickly as possible, because the monster was already conducting an attack with its powerful arm. Waving its claws in front of him, the guy miraculously managed to dodge. Seo Jinsu pointed the scope at the enemy, and there was utter confusion on his face. He shot a sticky net at his opponent, trying to delay him at least that way. The brunette was lying on the floor, still not fully recovered. Only the girl was making him hurry up and run away. Seo Jinsu headed past him, saying that it was worth it to just walk past him, or this guy was something very dangerous. And Artemis ironically replied that it was a good inference. Artificial intelligence led the way through these corridor mazes right to the staircase entrance. And while the brunette rejoiced that they would soon be done with this horror, the monster had already gotten out of the guy's net-like trap. But Artemis was the first to react, except that everything was happening too fast, and the girl did not have time to warn her partner. He only ordered Seo Jinsu to flee, and the infected was already heading towards the masked fighter with clawed hands outstretched. But the manager wasn't in much of a hurry to flee the battlefield. He just wouldn't have time to dodge well, so once again he pointed the gun at the enemy. The situation was escalating with every second. It was just a shock to realize that this creep had gotten free so quickly, and the big question was how he did it.